In the bright and spacious room of the castle, the murmur of the children could be heard. A beautiful baby with golden hair and bright pink eyes smiled at someone and happily waved his arms. The young woman saw that her young master had woken up, so she approached him. The man behind her said that, if the girl had repeated this in the palace, she would have already been executed for high treason. However, the young maid didn't care, because there were only 3 people in the room. The young man smiled tenderly, watching the girl rejoice over the child. The young woman looked at the man and asked if he wanted to hold the child. The boy clumsily took the child in his arms and was very amused by him. It wasn't easy for him to control his powers, so the man was afraid to grab the child too tightly. The child wasn't very happy either, but the girl wasn't too worried about it. She found it funny that the man assumed too much, because he was only a minister. After all, this is just a short story that the blonde accidentally got into. At first, it wasn't so easy to understand. She was too enchanted by the baby's angelic appearance. The child was bundled up. The girl hoped her short life would be good. Everything around her was Western style, and the angel's body temperature was the same as a human's. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and another woman entered, heading towards our heroine. She asked the young maiden how the young master was feeling today. It was the maiden who asked a certain Marie to take care of Prince Briel. Only after this did our heroine realize that these were the names of the characters from the story she liked to read on her way to work. Due to her love for children, she decided to become a kindergarten teacher, and she remembered the names of almost all the children from movies, dramas, and novels. The girl remembered that it was this story she read before dying. Then memories of other events from the novel appeared in her mind. Marie, whose body our heroine inhabited, was supposed to kill Prince Briel. The girl was horrified by what her heroine was about to do and dreamed of returning to her world. She hoped this girl would realize that it wasn't her body and decided that this would help her escape this world. Every morning, the girl hoped to wake up at home, but reality was cruel. The girl sank deeper and deeper into the abyss of despair, but suddenly something pulled her out of that state. The girl was pulled out of the abyss of despair by the cheerful laughter of the little prince. Just thinking about what would happen to the child after his death gave her 100 shivers. This baby smiled so sweetly and did not deserve a terrible death at all. The girl loved children too much, so she couldn't let this little angel die. Perhaps she was sent to this world to save the prince, because she felt very affectionate towards him. After a while, the girl realized the purpose of her life in this story, and she stopped her attempts to return to her home world. 3 months have passed since Marie started taking care of the young prince. As much as she wanted his parents to see him grow up, unfortunately they died in an accident. His uncle the Count identified the child, but the stranger changed the original plot and saved the little prince. She also brightened her uncle's life, because in the novel, he is terribly depressed by the death of his nephew. Marie loved taking care of this little one and helping him grow up as healthy as possible. She remembered that, when he first saw her next to the prince, the Count thought the girl wanted to kill him. She remembered the moment the young man put a sword to her throat. If she hadn't come to her senses at that moment and said that such exercises would help the child deal with his body, she might already be dead. Only after this did the young Count calm down a little and put away his weapon. The stranger believed that this way he would manage to earn her trust. Suddenly, the girl's attention was drawn to the little prince, who started rolling over and turning from side to side. The child had clearly learned to roll over and now wanted to show off his skills to the nanny. Marie took the baby in her arms, and at that moment the door to the room opened, and the Count entered. The girl was happy to see her master return and immediately greeted him. The baby in her arms was also very happy to see his uncle. As soon as the Count reached out to touch the child, Marie turned around and headed towards the crib. She asked the young man to wash his hands before touching the little one. This was not typical behavior towards the master, so the other servants pretended not to hear anything. While the Count stood frozen in surprise, Marie decided to play with the child. The young man remained as if in a trance. For some time, he could neither move nor say anything. At least he was glad that his nephew was having a good time. Marie noticed that the Count was standing at the door of the room, so she asked him to come closer. The girl knew that it was very difficult for him to express his feelings, even though he was quite handsome. This is normal, because the Count is raising a child for the first time, so he doesn't need to know how to behave correctly with him. The girl decided to help her master and invited him to play hide-and-seek. She demonstrated it herself, first hiding her face behind her hands. and then, abruptly, peeking out from behind him with a shout. Kentril was horrified that he was being asked to do such childish nonsense. Just a few hours ago, he had given his subordinates a total reprimand in the palace. He was a very serious man and never made faces in normal life. However, the nephew and the nanny were too cute, so the man covered his face with his hands and then looked behind them. Little Brielle was delighted with such activity from his uncle. The Count was very inspired by his nephew's reaction, so much so that he even forgot to contact the nanny. Marie was very happy to see the relatives having so much fun together. She was glad that her uncle and nephew could play together at any time. Overall, more than anything in the world, she wanted to protect the little one and take care of him. After a while, Marie suggested that the little prince walk a bit. At that moment, another girl flew towards her and said that she also wanted to go with her sister. Marie did not expect this at all, so she was horrified by what happened. The girl lost control for a second and let go of the prince's hands. The baby, who still couldn't stand up, started to fall. Marie didn't have time to catch him, but that same girl came to his aid. She instantly found herself behind the child and helped him stand up. The nanny was very glad that the young master was not harmed due to her carelessness. The girl hugged the baby and then asked if he was okay. Ellie clearly looked very frightened and embarrassed, holding her hands to her chest. Marie realized that the girl supposed the nanny would start saying bad words. That's why the girl decided to act a little differently and called her affectionately by name. She said that the floors in the room were very hard, so the children could get hurt if they fell. That's why the nanny asked the girl to only walk hand in hand next time. Kind words and a gentle pat on the head managed to calm Ellie. This charming young lady is actually Marie's sister, who played an important role in accepting the latter into the Count's family as a nanny. Since Marie did not give birth, another woman took care of the prince, but she could not look after him constantly, as she had her own child. In the original, it was Marie who said she couldn't entrust the little heir to anyone but herself. The girl thought she was hired as a nanny for her status, but it wasn't actually the case. They did it because she had experience raising her younger brother and sister. Prince Marie did not like her at all at first sight. However, when the nanny was about to be replaced, their relationship suddenly improved. This happened on the day the main character woke up in Marie's body. Therefore, the girl was partly sure that everything happened thanks to her rebirth. The stranger decided not to worry too much about this and just enjoy her new life. The little prince was growing by leaps and bounds. His legs were even stronger. Marie and Ellie lived together in the Count's family, so the girl sometimes wanted to take care of the prince too. Time passed and went on, and the prince began to behave more and more actively. For example, he was now crawling almost all over the room, which surprised his nanny. Marie was happy that the child learned to crawl and now did it all the time. She looked at her pupil and couldn't understand how someone could be so sweet. The child was already 7 months old and just a month ago couldn't even stand up. But now he is already moving his legs. Marie believed that he got his genes from his uncle and that he would grow up to be the tallest man in the entire kingdom. The baby grew up very fast, but the Count hadn't seen him for several days. Because he will be busy at the end of the year, the man cannot leave the palace. However, the girl promised the prince that he would see his uncle soon, and it turned out she was right. Sometime later, the Count returned home and first asked what his nephew was doing. The child was already asleep, so the young man was a little upset that he couldn't visit him. Firstly, Kentril went to see the nanny and asked about the child's well-being. Marie was happy that the Count was in a hurry to get home and wanted to see his nephew. She decided that he wanted to see the prince much more than she had originally thought. The child was already asleep, but the nanny allowed him to look at him quietly. After which, together with the Count, they went to another part of the palace, where the child's bedroom was located. The little prince lay in his crib, with his eyes closed, and was dreaming. The Count hadn't seen his nephew for a long time, so it seemed to him that the baby had lost weight. Marie noticed that the child had been very active lately, and the Count was pleasantly surprised. Kentril wanted to touch his little nephew, but the nanny forbade him. The girl didn't want the young man to wake the child with his cold hands. Only now did she realize that lately the Count himself had lost a lot of weight. However, she realized that this made him even more handsome. The Count noticed that the nanny was looking at him too long, so he asked what was wrong. Marie was surprised that he noticed her gaze and changed the subject. Instead, the girl said she wanted to sing a lullaby to the baby. She understood that the sleeping child did not need to hear anything, but she could no longer refuse. Marie gently covered the young crown prince with a blanket and began to sing. The count was pleasantly surprised by how melodious the girl's voice was. At that moment, it seemed to him that she herself was beginning to look even more beautiful. So they spent time together, rocking the sleeping child. A little more time passed. The count had a little less work and started coming home more often. This time, the young gentleman decided to visit his nephew and go to him. He immediately approached the baby and asked if he was having fun. Kentril noticed that the baby's teeth had already started to emerge. The count was worried because he hadn't participated in the baby's upbringing at all during all this time. He has nothing more valuable than his nephew, so he would like to spend as much time as possible with him, regardless of his tight schedule. And now the baby had already learned to crawl and was ready to demonstrate his next skill. Suddenly, he started moving strangely and tried to stand up. After a couple of seconds of awkward movements, the prince sat straight on his bottom. The count was very amazed at how much his nephew had grown and what he had already learned. Marie was very happy that the baby wasn't shy in front of his uncle and sat up on his own. The girl suggested that the young master would be delighted to see the count tomorrow. She had a great idea to do something that both of them would definitely like. The girl came up with a new game with textures, which she named after herself. She wanted the prince to try the game that many children his age love. After much thought, the nanny found a solution and went to the kitchen with seaweed. At this time of year, many were starving, so it would have been a crime to use overly good food. During the preparation, the girl thought that her uncle had recently started working more from home. She supposed the count had decided that he could not miss so many precious moments with his nephew. The nanny decided that playing with textures would bring her relative closer, so she invited the count to participate. The young master followed his subordinate and entered the bathroom with her. The girl enthusiastically showed him the bathtub, which was covered everywhere with slippery seaweed. The young count literally froze and couldn't understand what they wanted from him. No matter how much the man tried to hide his emotions, his confusion was too noticeable. The nanny explained that this is a very good game for developing muscles and expressing emotions in a child. She undressed the baby to bathe him and was already preparing to put him in the tub. The young count took his nephew in his arms and watched as the girl brought them seaweed. He carefully tore off pieces and placed them on the prince's face instead of his eyebrows. Now the baby had large and very thick green eyebrows. The prince was very interested in all this, so he immediately reached out to see what was on his face. The child was enchanted by this strange thing and started playing with it. The count couldn't accept what had happened at first, but he was glad his nephew was happy. After that, he relaxed and carefully lowered the child directly into the water. Kentril rolled up his sleeves and took the seaweed in his hands to play with the baby. At some point, he accidentally dropped seaweed into the water and splashed. The little one liked it so much that he started beating the water with his hands and splashing. Some of the water got on the young count, so the nanny gave him a towel. The girl was worried that the young master would get angry about getting his clothes wet. However, the count, sprayed with water, looked simply incredible. He was so handsome that Marie even stopped thinking for a second. The girl, walking with a towel in her hands, got lost in his eyes and tripped on her heels. She started to fall, but the count raised his hands and helped her, softening the fall. Only then did Marie realize that the man in front of her was her master. The young count was also disheartened by such a sudden change of position. He sat near the tub, completely wet, right on the floor with a maid in his arms. Due to the surprise, both froze for a moment and didn't move at all until the nanny recovered first. The girl abruptly got up and apologized to her master for her clumsiness. She turned around and ran to the other end of the room to look for more dry towels. Mary didn't understand why her heart was beating so fast. The young count said nothing about this situation, but his ears were burning. A little later, when the girl had free time, she decided to dedicate herself to sewing. Little Ellie ran up to her sister and asked what she was doing now. The nanny explained that she was sewing new toys for the young prince and invited the girl to take a look. Ellie was very upset because all these toys were intended for the little gentleman. Marie stroked her sister's head and clarified that for him there was only one bear. This gave the girl hope of getting the bunny. The nanny said that the bunny was a little bigger, so it would take a little longer to make it, but that she would definitely give it to the baby. Marie found it amusing that Ellie was already a happy adult, but sometimes still looked like a little girl. This behavior on the girl's part reminded her how surprised she felt when she first saw the house where they used to live. It was a dilapidated shack. They wore rags instead of clothes. There were no toys. She used the Count's money to provide the best clothes and food for her brother and sister. But what surprised her the most was that while she worked as a nanny, the children stayed home completely alone. It hurt her to look at them. So the girl asked the Count for a favor and permission for her family to live in the servants' quarters. Instead of a bed in the bedroom, the Count gave them an entire room on the same floor as the young prince. The girl in Marie's body was very happy to be able to give these children at least something. Therefore, as a form of gratitude, she felt the need to work even harder. Days passed one after another, until one day a loud scream was heard in the middle of the palace. The nanny and the maid tried to reach the young prince, who was screaming while sitting on the floor. The baby learned to crawl, so he immediately tried to run away if he didn't want to do something. The nanny knew how to attract the child with toys. She stood at one end of the room and distracted the baby's attention, while another maid quietly approached him from behind. The child was not happy to have been tricked and captured so easily. However, the girls needed to do this in order to change his diaper. Marie was glad that the young prince had lived almost a whole year. She hoped everything was fine, but sometimes anxiety visited her even on the quietest days. And all because the girl didn't know who ordered this baby's death and for what purpose. The prince sat in his uncle's arms and listened to him read him a fairy tale about dragons. The child was very excited, so the nanny thought he liked the story about dragons. Marie was happy that her uncle and nephew spent more time together after she had been absent for a while. She needed to translate some things, and the prince has been very shy lately, so he refused to spend time with anyone else. The Count responded to the butler's request and agreed to sit with the baby, and he stopped crying. However, this didn't last long, and after half an hour the Count regretted his decision. The man didn't understand how a 1-year-old child could be so fast. It was literally impossible to take his eyes off him, not even for a second, without him starting to destroy everything around him. The Count tried to scold the child and put on a serious expression, which is used when arresting high-ranking officials. However, the child didn't care about this at all and didn't listen to his uncle at all. Everything was going more or less normally until one of the books fell onto the baby's leg. The prince felt pain and immediately focused his attention on his leg. The baby was unpleasant, so he started crying, which scared the Count. The uncle tried to calm his nephew, but people had already rushed over upon hearing his cry. Then the nanny, who had just returned to the palace, immediately rushed to deal with it. She approached the Count and tried to find out what happened here. Kentrell noticed that the child was screaming, his eyes widened, and he began to get a fever. However, the baby himself had already stopped crying at that moment and happily looked at the pictures in the book. The nanny looked first at the Count, then at her nephew, and exhaled calmly. The prince liked the dragon in the book so much that the Count mistook his joy for illness. The nanny smiled and said that the young master had absolutely nothing to worry about. The Count was a little ashamed of his mistake, so he blushed deeply. This incident led the Count to start reading dragon stories to his nephew. However, at that moment, he looked very worried, and Marie smiled and pretended not to notice his emotion. But even then, it was clear that the Count was trembling with fear, because he had survived the death of his older brother and his wife. The novel did not describe the details of this accident, but it was noted that if the Count had arrived a couple of minutes later, Brielle would have died along with his parents. That's why he was so anxious about his little nephew now. Marie believed that this was why the Count reacted violently, even to the slightest sneeze. The girl understood that a huge wound remained in the young master's heart. One of the palace maids screamed heartbreakingly and called for the nanny as the prince pulled her hair. The prince always behaved very calmly, but as soon as the nanny left, he started getting hysterical. But at the mere sight of his beloved Marie, the prince immediately calmed down. This time, the child didn't stop crying for the entire time the girls spent in the bathhouse. The nanny asked the maid to hand over the young master so she could take a break. The maiden even thought that the young prince had a real split personality. Even the nanny noticed that the child had been getting quite stubborn lately. She promised the baby that she would quickly change his diaper and then pick him up again. The child understood everything perfectly, but something in his gaze suddenly changed. The prince looked directly at his nanny and said something very close to her name. He pronounced it a little wrong, but the girl was impressed anyway. He didn't call mom or dad or any other relative, but called her by her name. Although it wasn't exactly hers, the prince was able to alleviate the suffering the girl experienced after arriving in this world. The precious baby he managed to save became the only reason to keep living. His first word was a gift, as if he knew how hard it was for his nanny. After a while, Ellie ran in to greet her little sister and the young master. At that moment, the little prince was playing with his new toy. The child was so enthusiastic about this activity that he didn't even notice the girl's arrival. Ellie was very angry because the prince was more interested in the toy. Therefore, the girl approached and fell right onto his pyramid, destroying it. The little one was horrified that his creation was destroyed. Ellie started apologizing and running away, and the young one crawled and caught up with her, throwing bad words. Marie immediately realized that the girl was doing it on purpose to have fun with the prince. However, it was snack time, so the nanny brought a plate of food. She called this dish regular textures and allowed him to eat it with his hands. It was a very unusual dish that looked spicy, so Ellie blew on it. Then she handed the cooled piece to the young master and invited him to take a bite. Only after that did the girl turn to the plate and take a piece for herself. Accidentally, she touched a very hot potato and burned herself slightly. Marie thought with a smile on her face that Ellie clearly wanted to be like her older sister. She offered to help the girl and cool the potatoes a little. It was at that moment that the baby uttered his second word and called Ellie by name. The whole company communicated kindly and didn't notice that at that moment someone was watching them. It was a boy who was hiding behind the door and carefully watching what was happening. Marie decided to bring them all something to drink and asked the girl to look after the prince. The girl headed towards the exit of the room, and only there did she notice that same boy. It turned out to be Bari, who was the younger brother of the real Marie. The nanny thought the boy also wanted to go for a walk with the young master, so she took the boy by the shoulders and gently helped him into the room where the children were. The boy was clearly not used to being treated this way, so he looked surprised at his older sister. However, then he smiled happily and promised that everyone would have fun together. The nanny was very happy that all the children communicated so well with each other. She decided that she must quickly bring drinks and join them in the games. Bari turned to the young master and asked if he would like to play ball. The prince, whose hair Ellie braided, immediately drew attention to the boy. He immediately directed his attention to the boy and crawled right towards him. Bari tried to attract the prince's attention with a plush bear toy, and Ellie was sure that the prince was much more interested in being with her because she cooled his potatoes. At some point, a real war began between them for the young master's attention. The prince couldn't decide either whether he liked Ellie and the sweet potatoes he knew better, or the teddy bear in the boy's hands, so they would have kept fighting for the young master's attention if the nanny hadn't returned. Immediately after this, the baby, without thinking at all, crawled right towards her. Brother and sister immediately realized that they would never defeat this opponent. The prince loved his nanny Marie too much to even try to compete with her. The girl was very happy that the three of them interacted so well with each other. A little more time passed, and now they were lighting the candle on the cake. That day, the young master turned one, so everyone sang him a congratulatory song. The baby was very happy that so much attention was paid to him. The count decided to celebrate the prince's first birthday in the mansion with his closest circle. Instead of a lavish feast, he organized a nutritious dinner specifically for the prince. And instead of high-status nobles, he invited Ellie and Bari. The little one couldn't believe they had been invited to an aristocrat's birthday party. The nanny believed that the count had made the right decision, because the prince would have been very uncomfortable among strangers. And then he sat down and smiled with the most satisfied smile of all. After a while, the count decided it was time to blow out the Christmas candles. He got up from the table and invited the nanny to blow out the candles together, which surprised her. The girl didn't expect this from an aristocrat, but Kentrell always seemed a bit unusual to her. And yet, the heroine in Marie's body was very embarrassed by so much attention. She took the prince in her arms and stood next to the young count, while everyone else counted down. She didn't understand why she felt so nervous around her master. The girl was sure that the young master could now clearly feel her heartbeat. But it wasn't just the nanny who felt strange at that moment. The young count stared at the girl with his mouth open and literally couldn't take his eyes off her. He himself still didn't understand why this was happening, but he liked that feeling. Their idyll was interrupted only by the countdown, which ended at the most inopportune moment. The nanny and the count hesitated at the last moment and blew out the cake candle together. The nanny congratulated the prince, and suddenly he started waving his arms and touching her face. The girl lifted the baby higher and suddenly he kissed her on the cheek. Everyone who witnessed this action was simply struck to the heart in that very second. Absolutely everyone was jealous of how much the young prince loved his nanny. A little later, Marie put the child to bed and returned to her room. The girl walked through the empty and dark corridors of the palace and thought about how important today had been. In the original story, the boy did not live to see his first birthday, but this time he managed to do it. The girl was very moved and was glad to have achieved the goal she set for herself when entering this story. Marie continued walking down the corridors when she suddenly saw light coming from the count's room. The door was open. The girl thought the master was still awake and wanted to bring him coffee. However, the sight she found alone in that room was completely disheartening. Marie stood motionless and watched as her master sat alone and cried. The count stopped in front of the portrait of his late older brother and spoke to him. The man admitted that he missed his nephew's father very much and was afraid that he wouldn't be able to raise the child himself. He wished his brother could see Brielle's smile with his own eyes. The young woman was very moved by the sight she saw and now understood why the count had decided to organize such a celebration. Indeed, the man wanted to give a gift not only to the child, but also to his late brother. Marie didn't dare enter the room and disturb her master, so she stood outside the door for a while. And then she headed to her room. The prince's safety was a priority, but the girl decided to slightly adjust the goals in her journal of caring for him. Now she not only wanted to save him, but to make him very happy in this life. Ellie ran enthusiastically through the garden and was glad that the long-awaited day had come. Like a little prince, he sat in front of the girl and didn't understand what she meant. Ellie leaned towards the child and explained that today is the long-awaited day when the young master will learn to walk holding hands. The girl remembered that she had once tried to teach him this, but it didn't work. The nanny asked to be very careful because the prince learns quickly but can still fall. The little sister agreed, after which she took the baby by the hand and began to train him. The young master could already utter some words, even call people by name. Ellie decided to take advantage of the prince's kindness and asked him to kiss her if he was having fun. However, immediately after this, the child let go of her hand and turned in the other direction. The girl realized that she had rushed too much and began to apologize to the prince. The nanny watched their interaction and was moved. A little later, the girl approached the count and intended to discuss something with him. The young master immediately began to worry that something had happened to his precious nephew. However, she immediately hurried to assure him that her request was not related to the prince. She only said that it would be nice if the boy made friends his age, and asked where aristocrats usually introduced their children. Usually this happened at parent meetings, but the count hadn't gone anywhere for a long time. The original story stated that the count disliked being in company since he was little. He avoided all kinds of gatherings in every way possible, so he had almost no acquaintances in high society, and only 2 friends. One of his comrades had a son the same age as the prince, so the count promised to talk to his acquaintance. The nanny was happy to have solved this problem so quickly, so she prepared to leave. However, the count suddenly asked her to stay, after which he approached and handed her some kind of box. Marie opened it and saw a beautiful brooch on a soft pillow. The count knew that Marie had bought a brooch, but she didn't wear it while taking care of the prince. And then it went out of style. The heroine remembered that it was this brooch that the real Marie wore when she entered her body. The girl had to take it off, as any accessory can be dangerous for small children. New Marie was worried that her little sister would realize how much she had changed. She and Bari lacked love and attention, so they accepted these changes quite easily. Now the nanny was incredibly grateful to her master for such a gesture of attention. However, for some reason, the count decided that the girl did not like the brooch. He admitted that he chose the jewelry on his own, so it is possible that he did not guess her preferences. He admitted that it was the first time he had to choose a woman's brooch, so he was not sure how good it was. However, Marie smiled in the sweetest way and commented that her gift was simply beautiful. The count smiled back at the girl and said he was happy to hear this. After a while, the young prince was busy with something and called his uncle very loudly. The count immediately responded to his call and was glad that the child started calling him uncle. The prince wanted the count to leave the nanny, but it seemed he was chasing her away. Marie simply laughed at how funny the young master reacted to this. She took the child in her arms and explained that together they were choosing a new book for him to read. She offered him many different options to choose from, but the prince only wanted to read books about dragons. The nanny decided not to resist his wishes and began looking for books about dragons. However, they had already read everything on this topic, so they only had to write new ones themselves. So the girl looked at the count and suggested he write a children's book with drawings. It turned out to be too difficult for them, so they simply picked up a book they had already read. After a while, night came and the young prince fell asleep in his crib. The nanny noticed that the count was already doing an excellent job with the little boy, compared to how things were when she first came into this world. He has come a long way. After putting the child to bed, the uncle and the nanny left the room. The young man walked ahead, but suddenly stopped and the girl bumped into his back. The count turned to Marie, apologized, and asked if she was okay. His incredibly beautiful and sophisticated face confused the heroine. It seemed to her that the young count was too close, and the girl's heart began to beat faster. Marie blushed a lot and started behaving very uncomfortably and strangely. The girl started laughing nervously and tried to quickly leave the little prince's room. She sincerely believed that handsome men were especially dangerous at night. The next day, Ellie played wooden horses with her brother and the prince. They had a relay race, and Brielle thought the blue horse would win. In fact, it was moving forward a bit and was already almost at the finish line. However, at the last moment, a red horse suddenly rushed forward and took the victory. The older brother hit his little sister on the head as punishment for such trickery. He didn't want the girl to mock his master, because it wasn't the first time she pulled this trick with the horse. The prince saw the boy hitting Ellie, and angry, hit him himself. He didn't want anyone to offend his friends, so he hurried to protect the girl. Only now did Bari realize that Brielle had reacted so strangely to their fight. The little prince made it clear that he was clearly very angry about something. The child looked at his young master and didn't understand why he was hitting him. The prince, as best he could, tried to explain with words that all this was due to the attack on Ellie. The girl was truly delighted that her beloved prince defended her, and Bari was annoyed because he was hit, even though he spoke in favor of the young master. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the palace, the nanny was drawing cards with insects. It took her a long time, but this method should have helped the young master remember many new things. The nanny only hoped that her drawings turned out clear enough. However, the girl looked at her creation and realized it didn't look very good. It was at that moment that the count approached her from behind and asked what she was doing. The drawings were so terrible that the young master thought his nephew had drawn them. Marie was annoyed that someone thought her drawings were so bad. She even had to take the picture and clearly explain that it depicted an ant, after which the count took a pencil and in just a couple of seconds drew his ant, which looked much better. The nanny didn't understand at all why this man did everything so perfectly. She asked the butler about the count's grades during his previous studies. In response, the butler, with tears of joy in his eyes, said that his count got first place in all subjects in the exams. Therefore, he was also the best drawer of his time. Suddenly, the count approached one of the drawings and wanted to take it. He said he would collect them as souvenirs and show them to the prince when he grew up. However, Marie absolutely did not want to give him the card she had been preparing for a long time to teach the young master. The girl tried to reach him, but the count held the drawing above his head. Marie was much shorter than him, so she hung onto his arm to pull him down. The girl did this without thinking, which greatly embarrassed the count. Noticing his reaction, Marie herself realized that she had done something wrong. She was very uncomfortable, so she lost her balance while trying to take the drawing from him. After this, the girl fell into the arms of her young master again. The count seemed very embarrassed and surprised after this. He absolutely did not expect the girl to get so close to him and touch his body. But Marie, who came from the modern world, didn't pay attention to her action at all. Thanks to the count's confusion, she managed to take her drawing and walked away happily. The count realized that the girl didn't even understand anything, so he laughed at his own reaction. After a while, the nanny announced to the prince that a new friend would come to see him today. She hoped the boy would be very happy to see a child his age. After this, Brielle's world should have become a little wider, because after entering society, life changes a lot. They continued to chat pleasantly as they headed towards the count's friends. The uncle called his nephew and told him that he wanted to introduce him to new people. It was a young red-haired boy, the son of Jake the One-Eyed, a comrade of Count Jason. The boys approached and greeted each other, a little embarrassed by their first meeting. Their father and uncle went to talk and left the children with their nannies. Marie leaned down to the prince and asked if he wanted to play with his new friend. Children of that age usually liked toys, so it would be easier for them to get along. However, 10 minutes later, the loud crying of a child was heard in the palace. The Count and his friend heard this and immediately ran to the room where the children were. They arrived and saw little Jason sitting on the floor and crying. The nanny explained that the boy liked the prince's favorite toy, while they were choosing together what to play with. Only the prince himself, Marie, Ellie, and Bari had the right to touch Miss Bear. Both children liked the same toy, but the prince would not allow anyone to take his teddy bear. The nanny approached the Viscount and began to apologize for the little prince's behavior. However, the man noticed that everything was in order, as it was his son who grabbed the toy without permission. Thus, the first attempt to make friends failed, but they still had a lot of time ahead of them. Meanwhile, after putting the prince to bed, the nanny returned to her room. She was glad that her pupil was growing up in a safe and protected place. But there is still one problem that has not been solved. When the girl woke up in this world, there was already money in a bag under the bed. The real Marie received them as the first payment for the prince's murder. That's why the girl became interested in knowing why the clients hadn't come for her yet. Marie carefully examined everything around her, but found nothing suspicious. The girl didn't know what to do next if this order had already been transferred to someone else. She would really like everything to be as peaceful as it has been lately. She even had a flash of desire to tell the Count that someone wanted to kill the little prince, but she didn't know how to do it. Suddenly, the girl was startled by the Count, who approached her from behind. The man looked at his nephew's nanny and asked what had brought her to this place at such a late hour. The man was very worried about his nephew and thought something might happen to him. The nanny didn't expect to see the Count in this place at all at that moment, so she didn't know what to answer. She still didn't know what to do in this situation, so she asked the gentleman to speak. Marie decided to approach from a distance and asked if knights had already been selected to guard the prince. She couldn't tell the Count everything, but she could point him in the right direction. The girl remembered that, when she met her friend's son, he was already accompanied by security. The Count was surprised that the girl came to talk about this at such a late hour, but she simply attributed everything to her extreme lack of memory and her distraction. The Count was glad that Marie always thought only of her nephew. The man said that he already had several nights in mind, so he had to hurry before the big walk. The nanny immediately began to worry about the walk, but the Count promised that the child would be under the protection of the royal guard. The trip will be very soon, as the young man has already managed to request some time off. He admitted that he needed at least a little break after so many years of work. The nanny immediately understood from his appearance that something had happened in the palace. The Count hadn't met a person who was so sincerely worried about him for a long time, so it was difficult for him to get used to it. The young man decided not to worry the girl and told her that he just wanted to rest a little. The next day, the children played in the large inner garden again. Ellie was angry because it was now her turn to play with the young master. Brother and sister started arguing and fighting among themselves again for the right to attract the prince's attention. The young man sat and watched them argue among themselves. Suddenly, the prince called the boys and drew their attention to something on the side. There, one of the gardeners was watering the plants with a huge watering can so they wouldn't dry out. There was a small fountain nearby, so the children went to play with the water. The nanny didn't forbid them from doing this. She waited patiently with a towel in her hands nearby. While the children were playing, the Count approached them, followed by the secretary. The nanny thought the children would have to end the game, since the owner of the estate had returned. However, instead, the young man jumped into the fountain with the boys and started playing with them. His assistant didn't expect such behavior from his master at all, so he was shocked. It was the first time he had seen his boss with such a radiant smile, so he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Suddenly, an idea occurred to him that greatly frightened him. The guy ran up to the Count and begged him not to quit his service or go on vacation. He feared that the boss would enjoy spending time at home so much that he would never serve in the palace again. But at that moment, the little prince approached them and, with a smile on his face, said that he really liked the new game. The Count smiled tenderly at his dear nephew and continued playing with him with great pleasure. The secretary was even more surprised by how unusual his master's reaction was. But after the secretary's words, Marie finally understood how important the Count's work in the palace was. Legends about the knight's radiant smile have already begun to circulate in the workplace. A little more time passed, and the whole company embarked on the promised grand journey. The Count, the nanny, and the child had their first picnic in the large forest. They carried baskets with food and various types of toys for fun. The count, as promised, took care of the security, but without her they had no trouble. The prince wanted to take a walk in this forest, but the nanny did not know the area well, so she was afraid to go too far. In this case, the young count stood up and offered to go with them. The boys went deeper, but the prince was too inspired and ran very fast. At some point, the nanny could no longer keep up with their pace and let go of the baby's hand from hers. The prince was already too fast for her, but the girl tried to keep up with the child. Brielle saw a huge bunny in the middle of the path and ran towards it to show it to her nanny. Marie sighed with relief when she saw the child chasing the animal. However, suddenly, she had a strange feeling that they were in danger. The girl immediately approached the young prince and covered his body with hers, simultaneously screaming and calling for the count. The young man came running at these cries, literally, a moment later, and immediately asked what had happened. The nanny said she had the unpleasant feeling that someone was watching them. The count didn't notice anyone, but he knew that if there was someone among those bushes, he had probably already escaped. The man helped the girl up and promised her that he would send the knights to inspect the surroundings. He realized that Marie was trembling with fear and took the prince in his arms. Brielle didn't seem scared, so the count decided to return with his entourage. Marie nodded her head tiredly and followed her master back to the road. Subsequently, during an inspection, the knights did not find a single suspicious person in the park. It turned out they were really lucky that no one was there. However, the nanny still had a very heavy and oppressive feeling of anxiety in her soul. The girl turned out to be right. Someone was very displeased about letting this company get away. Time passed day by day. Brielle's second birthday arrived. This time, the girl stayed a little further away, and a young prince approached her and grabbed her skirt. This year, many more noble people were invited to his birthday. Marie was worried that the prince might feel uncomfortable, so she stayed close to him. The boy has already grown noticeably since his last birthday and is stronger. The girl smiled and decided that it was probably unusual for him to see so many unfamiliar faces. Suddenly, a gray-haired man with a beard called the nanny. The girl immediately recognized the prince's maternal grandfather and bowed to him. The man congratulated his grandson on his birthday and said he was happy to be personally present at this celebration. The child immediately hid behind his nanny, like a puppy. The count said that the lord's possessions were far from here, but he still arrived on time. The man slowly leaned towards the prince and wanted to show him something. He pulled a dragon-shaped plush toy from behind his back and gave it to his grandson. The prince was simply delighted with his new toy, because he loved everything related to dragons very much. The child was very embarrassed, but the nanny told him that he must thank his grandfather for the gift. The prince found the strength, bowed his head, and thanked his grandfather. The man stroked the baby's hair and expressed his gratitude to the girl for taking care of him. I realized that it is not always easy to take care of small children, but the prince had a wonderful character. The child began to pull on his nanny's dress and ask her to take him to Miss Bear. Marie apologized and said she would take the child to the room to put a new toy with the others. The girl took the prince's hand and asked him to be careful on the stairs. The grandfather was glad that his grandson was surrounded by such good people and could grow up calmly. He mentally told his deceased daughter that her son was living a great life. Ellie happily shouted that she had to hurry before the sun set on the horizon. They could never go down the slide before the holidays, which is why the children wanted to do it today. The girl took her friend to the site where there was a slide, which Marie offered to install. She explained that you have to climb up, then slide down, and then repeat everything in a circle. She carefully helped the little prince climb up and promised that he would slide down quickly now. The girl carefully placed the baby on the edge and pushed him down. The prince really liked the new fun, so he asked Ellie to take him again. After that, they started going up and down the hill one by one. The gardener who looked after the children never thought he would see such a charming sight. Ellie asked the prince if Miss Bear also wanted to take a ride. The girl was delighted with her older sister, who constantly sewed new dresses for dolls. When it comes to the young master, Marie thinks of every detail. The girl noticed that the little prince completely repeated her posture, crossing his arms over his chest. Marie, passing by, realized that the children had come up with a new game. Then, the girl showed the pose she saw at the market, which surprised the nanny. Marie ran to the children and asked them where they had seen this. She asked the children not to do this again because it could hurt someone's feelings. Later it was time for dinner, and then a new dish was served at the table. The little prince happily decided to try the first piece and evaluate it. He sat in a special chair with everyone at the same table, and the nanny Marie fed him. Marie asked the Count if he wanted to try feeding his nephew himself. The butler was not pleased that his master was personally taking care of such matters. However, the Count said everything was in order, and that he himself wanted to feed his nephew. He took a little food on a spoon and tried to give it to the little prince. The little one did not want to eat from his uncle's hands. He preferred the nanny. However, she asked him to try it at least once in case he liked it. The baby obediently opened his mouth and swallowed everything his uncle gave him. He ate one spoonful, but refused to take anything more. The Count tried to keep feeding the child, and he himself turned to the nanny with a question. He looked the girl in the eyes and asked if she was free tomorrow night. Marie was completely free and asked the gentleman if something had happened. However, the Count just smiled tenderly and asked if the girl would like to have dinner together. The nanny did not expect such a proposal from her boss. He invited her to have dinner together in that setting. It was like an invitation to a date. A little later, she found out that it was not a date invitation because the prince was supposed to dine with them. Marie didn't understand how a date occurred to her, since it was definitely a nice dinner with the young master. The young man asked if the prince had gained weight because he looked quite chubby. The nanny said she just wanted to keep the baby warm because it was colder today. The Count asked the girl not to forget to take care of herself. A girl noticed that it wasn't that cold today, which left the young man stunned. The Count was worried that the nanny would get sick and infect the prince. Only these words influenced Marie, and she immediately hurried to dress warmer. Seeing such a reaction from the girl, the Count smiled tenderly and sighed. He admitted to himself that the girl meant much more to him than just a nanny. The man said this out loud, but the prince didn't understand what he meant. After a while, the whole company went to the grand hall for dinner. The Count wanted to feed his nephew himself, but the nanny said it was her responsibility. The man asked the girl to show the prince how much he liked this food. Marie resigned herself and decided to try an excellent piece of meat with sauce. She cut off a little and brought it to her mouth, enjoying the taste of the meat. The girl was very happy to be able to eat such a wonderful meal, but something still bothered her. All this made her think about her younger brothers and sisters. The Count said they could take the children, but she decided not to because of the numerous rumors. However, next time Marie decided to take the children with her and offer them the best dinner of their lives. Our company was eating quietly in the restaurant, and at that moment, other visitors directed their attention to them. Men and women immediately recognized the Prime Minister at the next table. They simply couldn't see their colleague, but they noticed how cheerful the Count was. They had never seen a young man smile so friendly towards someone. The man was simply in shock, as until then he had only heard rumors from his colleagues. During working hours, the Count was very insensitive and adhered to the image of a man who never smiled. However, in this restaurant, he looked like a completely different person. The woman was very unhappy because her husband devoted more time to his boss. She wanted him to pay all his attention to her and not work. After dinner, the Count and the nanny went home to put the child to bed. The girl herself carried the baby in her arms, so the young man thought it might be difficult for her. However, as soon as he put the prince on the floor, he immediately asked to be returned to her arms. At the same time, he did not want to go into his uncle's arms at all. He only wanted to be with the nanny. Then the Count asked Marie if he should give her a massage. He may now hold a civilian post, but in his service as a knight, he had to study basic medicine. The girl sat down on a chair, and the Count approached from behind and placed his hands on her shoulders. The man said that almost all middle and younger sons join the Order of Knights, but he left it early. The nanny became very interested in knowing why this happened, but the Count remained silent. The original novel said nothing about the man wielding a sword. Even at his birthday party, he thought it was time for the young prince to hire tutors. The boy was already 2 years old and had 2 favorite teddy bears. The prince loved looking at his toys, especially when they were together. Also next to them, on the shelf, were cards with drawings. With these cards, the boy learned various types of insects and other animals. The nanny, with an intelligent look, told the prince that ants have 6 legs. The girl added that almost all insects in the world have 6 legs. However, the prince would ask endless questions until the girl could answer them. He reached an age where he began to ask many questions. Marie didn't know what to answer the baby, so she suggested asking his uncle. She apologized mentally to the Count, whom she would now have to explain all this to. The young man was very glad that his nephew approached him first. The nanny just glanced at how her boss was suffering and couldn't do anything. She noticed that the count had even turned pale during the last half hour he spent with the boy. The young man said that a genius who got first place in the Royal Academy exams should come. He decided to take private lessons for now to be able to answer any question from the curious prince. A little later, after resting, the nanny told her young master about this new man. She was about to have tea with the prince when she heard loud shouts in the hallway. The girl was afraid that something terrible might happen. She immediately ran to the young master to check if he was okay. However, when the girl ran into the room, nothing terrible had happened. The young prince was alone with a long-haired young man. The nanny realized how silly she looked now with this tea in her hands. The man said he was just trying to teach the young prince how to write in cursive, but suddenly he shouted very loudly. The man himself didn't understand why this happened. A few minutes ago, Professor Yuges was teaching the boy how to write numbers correctly. He noticed that the prince had trouble concentrating, so he suggested learning to write his uncle's name. But the boy first wanted to learn to write the name of his nanny Marie. The teacher already knew that the young master simply adored this beautiful girl. The child immediately realized that his personal teacher was interested in his nanny. That's why he shouted, because he didn't want to share her with anyone. They only had 2 words left to learn, but the boy started trying to scare away his teacher. It was these shouts that Marie heard when she passed by with tea. It was difficult for Yuges and Marie to understand what really happened. The girl assumed that the boy was simply not used to doing anything without her nearby. And the teacher thought that the prince simply did not like certain words. The nanny said that the boy likes almost all fruits and that he loves dragons. A little later, after the lesson ended, the children went to play in the garden. Marie noticed that her little brother often played with the young master. She believed that the prince liked playing with him because the boy was physically stronger than his sister. This is how Wrath and the girl ran to their friends to join them. Marie was glad to see that Ellie is not angry now, but is looking for a way to play together. The girl brought a flower crown and cheerfully showed it to the prince. However, she became sad when she realized that the boy was not paying attention to her. The child did not want to bother his friend, so he thought for a while. Then he lowered his head and asked for a crown to be placed on him. Bari watched his sister carefully smooth the young prince's hair. He was annoyed that the boy fell for the girl's acting skills. Marie smiled and decided that she would need to find a game that all 3 could play. Last time, their water game made even the count smile, so it would be good if he could play with his nephew more. At that moment, an important visitor appeared in the young count's reception room. It was the king himself, who came to ask if his prime minister had time to eat before work. The count absolutely did not want to be distracted from his work, so he answered without lifting his head from his papers. The king clearly did not want to leave so easily, and continued to bombard the man with questions. The count could not oppose him, but with all his appearance tried to force him to leave the office. The king sat down on a chair and invited the man to have a drink in the evening and spend the night at the castle. However, the count declined this offer and asked to be left alone. The king laughed and said that earlier the man would have replied that he intended to work all night. He had heard rumors that lately the count had even started smiling. The man realized that this happens when he remembers his nephew or Marie. The king knew in advance that they would not invite him to the child's 3rd birthday, but he still asked. He wondered what would happen if the count had his own child. The king also heard rumors that the child had a sweet nanny. Immediately after these words, the count suddenly became serious and asked who was spreading these rumors. However, almost immediately, he came to his senses and distanced himself from further questions. The man didn't understand why he was offended that someone else was talking about her like that. He decided to focus on work, but the king had already noticed his prime minister's strange reaction. And at that very moment, the nanny Marie was doing housework. She realized that her brother had grown a lot and needed to buy a new shirt. His younger sister and the young prince grew moderately, which made her very happy. Then the girl noticed the rain outside the window, which suddenly started. It seemed to her that a bird had knocked on the door, although the windows could not be opened. Suddenly, something extremely strange caught our girl's attention in the garden. Marie moved even closer to the glass and tried to look into that something. Forgetting all warnings and safety measures, the nanny abruptly opened the balcony door. At that moment, she realized that this was related to the original story of the novel. She realized that the person who ordered the prince's assassination had located her. It was his figure that she saw deep in the hallway opposite her room. Marie clearly felt someone else's gaze upon her and got goosebumps. The girl was standing in the pouring rain, her hands trembling with fear. The nanny realized that feelings in reality and in the book were absolutely different from each other. Now she was alone on the balcony and felt in danger. Our girl still found the strength to ask who was hiding in the forest. At some point, the heroine even thought that the man opposite had heard her. However, after a moment, she could no longer see him among the trees. Marie could only stand and stare into the distance. After a while, the nanny realized that the man had left and would not return. One day, a similar downpour fell, and a girl was sitting alone on the porch. Ellie didn't have the keys, and her sister and brother had to return late. Therefore, the girl had no choice but to sit and wait for their return. The rain still didn't stop, so Ellie quickly got cold and wet. The girl was very cold. She was trembling from the piercing wind. She did not wait for her family to return and lost consciousness. After a while, the girl regained consciousness in a warm and dry room. She was lying on a bed in the middle of a bright and comfortable room, with a refreshing bandage on her face. The girl expected her sister to have come, so she jumped off the bed abruptly and cheerfully. But it was neighbors who were talking about rumors about her family. They said that Marie abandoned her sister and decided to take care of her brother only, because raising him was much more useful. There were also rumors that the nanny took all their money and simply ran away. Some time later, Marie and Bari appeared in the doorway of their former home. The neighbors were unhappy because the girl didn't even greet them after returning. Ellie remembered that her sister really didn't care about the well-being of the younger ones. She had nowhere to live and not enough money for anything, so she decided to give up Ellie. The children never went against Marie's will and accepted any of her decisions. The girl forced the younger ones to eat, even when they couldn't fit anything else in. She always said that it was very difficult for her to get this food, so the children should be grateful to her. With a stern expression, she forbade the children from leaving the table until they had finished eating. Marie began to fatten up the younger ones when she learned that the Count was looking for a nanny for his nephew. The girl believed that her well-fed appearance would be an advantage for her. Marie was deep in debt, and when the lenders chased her, she simply ran away, leaving Ellie. In the original story, a dark hand handed her a bag of silver coins when she became a nanny. The outsider was sure that this was the man who was now among the bushes. However, she decided it was her imagination, because the Count had overly reliable security. The girl's head was completely filled with these thoughts. She didn't know what to do. The moment the stranger was completely desperate, Ellie ran to her. With just her appearance, she was able to pull the girl out of despondency. The little one had an excellent smile on her face, which immediately cheered up everyone around her. Following the girl, the young prince ran in, who also wanted to support his nanny. The children wanted to take care of their nanny and help her dry her hair after the rain. This image could cheer up the girl. She even smiled. Marie remembered that she was not alone now, and that with these children she had nothing to fear. A little later, the girl washed up and went to prepare a wonderful and delicious tea. She told the Count that she had seen a suspicious figure near the mansion. Marie could not see his face, because the man disappeared as soon as their gazes met. She remembered that last time there was no one at the picnic. Therefore, the girl was not sure that this time the Count would believe her words, because she could not tell him what she knew from the novel. However, she told the Count that he should expand his security beyond his personal guard. She promised to invite the knights as quickly as possible. The stranger was glad, but did not understand why the man always listened to her. She could not understand why he fulfilled her requests without asking a single question. However, the girl decided not to think about it and simply thank him for his trust. Marie turned her gaze towards the Count and saw that he was looking at her strangely. But the young man simply said that nothing special had happened now. However, the nanny still thought her face said the complete opposite. The Count sent the nanny to her room to rest, and he himself thought about something. He remembered the king's words that his nephew had a very nice nanny. The man was worried about not being able to tell the girl these words, although he didn't understand why. He wondered who the person Marie had seen could be. The little prince behaved capriciously all day and didn't want to eat, throwing cutlery. The boy was hysterical all day. Even the nanny couldn't understand what was happening to him. She thought the young master would become less capricious as he grew older. However, now the little prince pointed at the soup and demanded that the nanny feed him. The girl simply looked at her charge and thought that he hadn't changed at all. But the time has already come when the child needs to learn table etiquette. The young master is growing up quickly. One day he will no longer need a nanny, and she will have to write this post. However, this moment has not yet arrived, so the girl tries to enjoy every day. In fact, she would like to take care of such a cute baby for as long as possible. However, for now the baby kept throwing tantrums for any reason. He demanded that the nanny sleep with him or read him a fairy tale if he asked. He also refused to even wash his face himself, not to mention the rest. The nanny realized that the child was overdoing it and went to his uncle for advice. The girl carefully knocked on the door of his study and said she had come for the young master. The nanny said the child had been behaving strangely lately. Suddenly, the count turned around and the girl thought she had said something wrong. The young man looked quite embarrassed, but in reality, he couldn't say anything. Marie thought that in any other situation, she would have already started panicking. However, now the girl saw that the count was just thinking about something. The man said he simply thought the prince's behavior could be a common protest. And usual, he sincerely believed that this behavior was temporary. The man remembered how not long ago the boy ran to him with a worried face. Then, the count also thought his nephew was growing up very quickly and could already run alone. The boy left his uncle stunned by asking him if he had a lover. The prince forbade his uncle from marrying before he was older. The count didn't understand at all why such a problem suddenly arose when the butler intervened. The man cleared his throat a little and slowly leaned towards his master. He spoke about what he had heard on his own a few hours ago. Then, the young prince and his friend played together and made crayon drawings. The little knight drew something terrible, which actually turned out to be his favorite toy. Miss Bear. The boy was very surprised by this, because the drawing didn't look like a cute toy at all. The young prince felt offended by his friend's opinion and walked away. Brielle was worried, because his uncle was good at absolutely everything. He remembered how his nanny gave him a card with an ant that his uncle had drawn. The girl at that time was very delighted with the count, so the baby was jealous of him. He wanted to become as magnificent as his uncle as soon as possible. However, Jason noticed that even the count himself couldn't handle some things very well. He said that there is actually one thing that escapes the head's control, and this was real and sincere love between a man and a woman, like in books. The boy's father said that the prince's uncle was very good at work, but very bad at love. But it was good because if the uncle finds a wife, the nanny will have to leave. The prince did not want to lose his beloved Marie at all, so he was very upset. The head butler heard this whole conversation between the small children. It was because of this incident that the count promised his nephew not to marry. However, the man didn't understand why Marie came to his mind now. The girl spontaneously appeared in his head after asking about his beloved. A little later, the nanny and the young prince went shopping at the city market. There they wanted to choose a gift for little Ellie. The prince really liked the little yellow box because it was the girl's favorite color. The nanny remembered that, however, the count told her the reason for these scandals. The young man even hired a guard to take a ride in honor of Ellie's birthday. He promised to form a whole order for Brielle, but the nanny was still worried about many things. After all, in fact, the main threat has not disappeared during this time. That rainy day probably saw the man who ordered the prince's assassination. When the girl got into Marie's body and refused to kill, a parallel story about this criminal appeared. The outsider still didn't understand who wanted to kill the little one. Suddenly, through the window, the girl saw a suspicious man on the street. She immediately drew attention to him because her intuition told her so. The girl froze in horror and didn't understand why this man was in such a place. The nanny immediately recognized the man on the street as Derek, the owner of the longest sword in the kingdom. In the original story, he was a loyal subordinate of the main villain. The man mercilessly killed everyone who stood in his and his master's way. The nanny didn't understand what that person was doing in the capital at that moment. It seemed to her that his story should have changed because the prince did not die. The boy was pulling at his nanny's skirt and didn't understand why she suddenly froze. Marie said everything was fine and suggested the boy return to the mansion. She hoped that the count's story would be different from what was described in the novel. However, the girl didn't know that the count had guests later that day. This mysterious visitor turned out to be the same Derek from the market. A young man with a scar on his face entered the room and bowed to the count. The young master, with a single gesture, ordered him to sit next to him on the sofa. The count did not want to hesitate, so he decided to get straight to the main task. He admitted that he invited Derek, because he learned that his brother's death was not an accident. The prince's grandfather arrived. The count thought the daughter-in-law would be happy to see that her father was well. While talking to the portrait of his late brother, the count saw something strange behind the frame. The young man realized that there was something behind the portrait, hanging on the wall. This secret could be very dangerous for his family, so he had to act carefully. The count decided to ask his subordinate if he would be on his side until the end. Derek, without thinking for a second, took his sword from his belt. He knelt down, took the sword with both hands and bowed his head. In the most difficult moments of his life, the count was with him, so the man will be by his side until the end of his life. The young master was satisfied with this answer and thanked him for his loyalty. Some time later came the prince's third birthday, which was much more luxurious than the previous two. The count invited all the most influential people in the surrounding capital. He also helped with Ellie's birthday because he is friends with his nephew. The nanny watched her children play and advised them to get ready. The fact that there will be many nobles at the festival means that many rumors will arise there. They mainly talked about the fact that the count's successor would be his nephew, even if he got married. Many had never seen this prince himself, so they wanted to meet the boy as soon as possible. And the prince completed his final touches before the official exit to the guests with his nanny. He admitted to his uncle that he was not worried or afraid of this event at all. The count looked at the sea and told her to also go out with them to the guests. The girl was very surprised by this, because an ordinary nanny is considered only a service staff member and does not participate in these events. She did not want to attract unnecessary attention, so she advised the count to go alone with his nephew. The girl stroked the prince's head and promised him that next time she would go with him. Marie believed that a child should not appear in high society with his nanny at the table on an important day. And in the main hall, the appearance of Count Kentril and his nephew Brielle had already been announced. Despite the lack of anxiety, the child was still a little embarrassed by so many guests. However, the count noticed and offered his hand to his nephew as help. The boy happily took his uncle's hand and felt confident in his abilities. So they walked down the stairs, supporting each other on this difficult path. And the stranger on the balcony thought that she had really come to this world to save the prince. The girl was happy with this role because it brought her true joy. Marie turned around with a calm soul and headed towards the inner piece of the mansion. A little later, when the holidays were coming to an end, the girl went out and sat on the stairs with a bottle of wine. She was sitting alone when suddenly someone threw a jacket over her shoulders. It turned out to be the count, who saw the girl and was worried that she was dressed so lightly. He had already put his nephew to bed, and now he himself wanted to rest a little from this event. The man noticed that the cute nanny was sitting on the stairs drinking alone, to which Marie replied that her body already tolerated alcohol. After that, the count fell silent, and the nanny briefly looked at his smiling face. She suddenly remembered how the count changed in the novel after the prince's death, where he cried and thirsted for revenge. That's why Marie looked at her master and promised him that they could protect the prince. The count turned to the girl, with an expression of incomprehension on his beautiful face. But for a few seconds he froze in silence, not knowing what to answer her. However, then he smiled tenderly and agreed that together they could do anything. Marie jokingly suggested that the count swear on this with their pinkies. The girl at that moment looked very happy and truly calm, and the count hoped that someday he would be able to express all his feelings for this girl. A few more days passed. Kentril went to the royal castle for an audience. The young count was walking down the corridor when suddenly someone called him by name. The man turned around and saw Her Majesty the Queen behind him. He knew that Her Majesty loved luxury, but today there were only 2 maids of honor with her. The count immediately put one hand behind his back, extended the other towards his stomach, and politely bowed to his queen. The girl kept calling him by name, so the count asked her to stop doing it despite their rather close relationship. However, the queen pointed out that any other address would be much stranger. The count said that, although they were relatives, he was not allowed to meet them more than once a year. The queen decided to change the subject and asked how the young prince was. Then, with bitterness in her voice, the girl added that she had no news about children. The count believed the queen that everything would turn out for the best for him and Her Majesty. Then the girl asked how the count was doing on the love front and invited him to introduce her to one of his friends. However, she remembered that no girl would want to marry the count without having the chance to inherit his son, because in any case, his nephew would be the successor. After this short conversation, The queen left the count and continued with her business. Meanwhile, the little prince in his mansion called his nanny to show her something. It turned out that Jason lost, and the prince wanted to boast about it. However, the nanny came to stop the fight and said that both children were great. The one who benefited most from the young master's fencing lessons was Bari. This will give him the opportunity to become the prince's knight in the future, and not remain just the nanny's brother. Marie brought refreshments for her brother and his knight master. Taylor was born a commoner, but became a genius swordsman and the prince's teacher. The knight and the nanny began to talk sweetly, and the prince watched them from the side. He listened attentively to what the adults were saying and observed their facial expressions. The boy didn't want to leave these two together for long, so he approached his teacher and asked her for another round. Even the nanny was surprised how energetic the children were today. Some time later, the young prince was sitting on a horse with all the equipment and holding the reins. The little one was trembling with fear, and with tears in his eyes, asked his uncle to put him down on the ground. Even the servants recommended starting training on inferior horses, but the count assured them that everything would be fine. Marie was very worried about her young master because he still had trouble holding the saddle. The girl wanted to help the prince, but decided to restrain herself and let him learn everything on his own. The count said that once the prince had ridden a tall horse, he would never be afraid of a short one. He promised that this would accelerate his learning of horse riding. However, the boy cried and cried, so the count gave up and decided to help his nephew. The count touched the reins and accompanied his nephew on his first horseback ride. Gradually, the boy calmed down and stopped crying, mesmerized by the view. At some point, he became so daring that he even looked back and waved to the nanny. Marie was very happy that her young charge was doing so well. Sam also enjoyed the horse ride and was happy about the time spent together. He remembered how his older brother once taught him to ride a horse. The nanny observed her young master's activities and didn't notice anything around her. That's why the girl got scared when one of the horses approached her from behind and touched her with its muzzle. The groom said that this horse is usually not very friendly, but that it liked the girl. Marie slowly raised her hand and gently stroked the horse's muzzle. Someone offered to give the girl a ride, but she refused because she didn't know how to ride. Then an attractive young man offered his help to the girl. He said that Adam, the horse, usually doesn't much like riding anyone. However, he clearly liked Marie, so the man hoped they could travel together. He said that this horse has excellent pedigree, but no one has managed to stop him yet. There was a hidden motive in the boy's eyes, because he wanted to be the first. The young man was supposed to teach the prince, but the count did it alone, so he had free time. The stranger remembered that in her previous life, she had never been able to ride a horse due to the rain. The girl didn't want to miss her chance, and hoped the prince would have fun riding with her in the future. While she was thinking, the young knight finished getting ready and approached the girl. He apologized for his actions and gently lifted the girl into the air with his hands. After a second, he carefully placed her in the saddle and told her to hold the reins. Marie did not expect such agility, so she stood motionless for a while. Taylor was still holding the girl by the waist and looking at her with joyful eyes. At that moment, the count and his nephew were riding horses and talking about something. The little prince hoped that his nanny also knew how to ride a horse. The count thought that teaching the nanny to ride a horse was not a bad idea. It might turn out quite useful. Suddenly, the young prince started shouting and pointing at something ahead. The count raised his head and saw Knight Taylor holding the nanny by the waist. Marie said she wanted to try riding a horse, so the teacher helped her. However, the prince kept shouting that no one should touch Marie without his permission. The boy was very angry at his teacher for daring to touch his nanny. The prince admitted that Marie would definitely marry him, which discouraged the count. This ended the incident, and everyone went about their business. The count was busy with work when the butler announced that news had arrived about Derek's appearance in the capital. The boss thanked his servant for the information and allowed him to proceed. The count took a deep breath and leaned back in his desk chair. He sat in silence for a couple of minutes and then opened the top drawer of his desk. From there, he took out a thick leather notebook with his initials on the cover. The count opened his diary and read some notes from his late brother about the prince's birth. The man still couldn't believe that his brother died, leaving the child with him. While he was reading, there was another knock on the oak door of the study. The count allowed her in, and a nanny appeared behind the door, wanting to show him something. The girl approached the gentleman's desk and showed him a small plate of cookies. She said that she and the prince baked cookies. He helped with the molds, The young man didn't even realize that his nephew was already old enough to create something similar. Watching a child grow up is his most desired reward and his bitterest sorrow. It seemed to the Count that if he blinked, the prince would be ready to leave this house. Outlander, I heard from people that the Count is very cold and frightening. However, in reality, everything is the complete opposite. She even guessed what he was thinking about. She remembered this simultaneously bitter and joyful feeling of growing children from when she worked as a kindergarten teacher. All children grow up, so the girl took the cookie and tossed it into the Count's mouth. She laughed because the gentleman himself would never have decided to taste such a beauty. Marie asked the man to spend as much time as possible with his nephew and talk to him more often about how much he loved him. These words truly surprised and touched the young Count to the depths of his soul. Then, the man accepted a large plate of cookies offered by the nanny and smiled. He came up with some words about love that he needed to tell his nephew. The Count's face turned so red from it that the nanny started to worry about the temperature. The girl wanted to touch the young master's forehead and reached her hand out to his face. The nanny asked if the Count was sleeping enough, because in recent days she hadn't seen him outside his office. The young master didn't answer her and simply staggered. Before the girl had time to come to her senses, the Count lowered his head onto her shoulder and lost consciousness. The nanny started screaming, and the rest of the servants helped the girl carry the Count to his room. The little prince looked at his unconscious uncle and worried about his health. However, the nanny noticed that the man only needed a few days of rest. He worked day and night when he suddenly caught a cold, so the girl tried to remain calm to avoid unnecessary worry from the prince. The boy wanted to stay with his uncle, but the nanny noticed he could get infected. She asked the prince to show his uncle how strong he was and to behave prudently. The girl called the butler and sent the prince with him to the other children. She herself stayed in the Count's room to take care of him during his illness. After a while, the Count regained consciousness and sat upright in his bed. The nanny brought some food to the young man and told him that the prince was very worried about him. Although the last time the boy cried was when he promised to marry his nanny, the Count admitted that he should thank Marie for being there all this time. The girl said that all this was for the good of the prince, because she couldn't admit that she herself was worried. Instead, she asked the Count to reduce the number of working hours, because this also affects the relationship with the prince. After a small snack, the nanny asked the Count to take medicine. However, he behaved like a small child and said that it was very bitter. Marie laughed at how nicely the young man was acting. However, the girl realized in time that she was laughing too loudly, so she covered her mouth. The Count was still a little angry with her for such behavior, but he just smiled. He looked into the distance and said tenderly that he didn't like it. Marie didn't quite understand what he was talking about, so she asked for clarification. The Count wanted the girl to feel comfortable spending time with him. The nanny didn't expect to hear such words at all, so she was very surprised. The Count noticed that he had said something unnecessary, so he decided to improve the situation a little. He explained that he considers the nanny family, because she has lived in his house for a long time. Only then did Marie realize that she had grown close to the Count, almost as much as to the prince. The girl would never have thought she would hear something like this from him. If she had known that the Count was so kind, she wouldn't have cursed him so much when reading the novel. Fans of the main characters often criticize Kentrell for the role he plays, and the girl was no exception. The nanny continued to chat sweetly with her master and laugh, and she thought that she wouldn't even know how she would behave if she found herself in the situation of the Count from the original story. In the middle of the conversation, the girl became very serious and turned to the Count. She looked the gentleman straight in the eye and asked if anyone held a grudge against him. She tried to give some examples to explain what she meant by these words. The young man was a little annoyed because the girl had this opinion of him. The Count said he had no people who could hold a grudge against him. He answered so quickly that it was very hard for Marie to believe him. The Count moved away from the girl towards the window, and she no longer dared to ask him anything. Instead, she picked up the dirty dishes and wished the Count a speedy recovery. After that, the nanny quickly got up and left this room. The Count was very impressed by the girl's words that someone might hold a grudge against him. He remembered that someone might have been angry with him since the moment he became prime minister. The man worried that someone might want revenge by using the prince. However, he didn't believe that anyone had serious feuds with his brother. His older brother was a wonderful man who had no enemies. Unless someone wanted to cruelly take revenge on his parents, through the children themselves. As soon as the man thought about it, something suddenly came to mind. The man decided to start looking for information about this matter. But for now, he continued to pretend that nothing had happened. The little prince ran down the hallway and tried to catch up with his uncle. For now, he was simply glad that a little rest had done the count good. The prince extended his hand forward and wanted to share something with his beloved uncle. The boy opened the palm of his hand, and it turned out there was a small candy on it. It was a gift for my uncle, who had to take bitter medicine, although he didn't like it. The prince said that he has his own ways of getting this kind of information. Literally, a couple of moments later, Marie appeared around the corner, and she asked her charge not to run away so fast anymore. The count immediately realized that it was the nanny who told the prince about her complaints regarding the bitter medicine. But the man wasn't angry about this at all, he just laughed. The count asked the nanny to give him some time because he wanted to ask something. A few minutes later, aromatic tea was already served on the table, and there were delicious desserts. In fact, the count wanted to talk about Bari's admission to the academy. Here the ceiling for the development of the boy's abilities was quite low, so he was interested in his older sister's opinion. Marie knew that for a member of a fallen noble family, the opportunity couldn't have been better. Due to the high cost of education, even in rich families, only the eldest sons are sent to the academy. Marie said that this would open up many opportunities for the boy. But they couldn't ask for that, because the count had already done so much. The count heard from Taylor that Bari was excellent with the sword. He believed that if his skills were already so good, with proper polishing, they would simply shine. The boy will be very useful to the family if he becomes a great knight. Marie knew that no one would be safe until they found out who ordered the prince's murder. It would be good if Bari could defend himself alone, so the girl approved the count's idea. The prince listened to their conversation and remembered that the academy was located quite far from the capital, so he could only come home during the holidays. The boy didn't want to be separated from his older friend, so he started shouting and protesting against this decision. Then he jumped off the sofa and ran out of the room crying. Marie's relatives are sad about the fact that Bari will leave for the academy, but all the mansion's neighbors congratulated him a lot before he left. However, there was one angry person who did not want to do this. And now the nanny walked through the huge garden and called her pupil loudly. Her younger brother, Bari, also helped search for the young prince. Suddenly, the boy saw blonde hair among the flowering bushes. He immediately realized that it was the young prince hiding in them. Bari asked the little knight if he really wouldn't tell him anything before leaving. The young prince didn't want to talk to Bari and therefore turned his back on him. The boy was crying because he was told he would go to the academy. The nanny's brother was happy to see that the prince would miss him, but he was still worried. The little one was very upset because he wouldn't be able to see his friend for a long time. This image even brought real tears to Bari's eyes. The boy knelt down and gently wrapped the child in his arms, pressing him against him. If Bari leaves, the prince will have to practice fencing alone. There will be no one to practice with. And besides, there would be no one to carry him in his arms. That's why he didn't want to part with his friend. Bari couldn't refuse such an offer, but the prince sweetly called him brother. He was smart and kind, so Bari carefully put him down on the ground and took his hand. He promised Brielle that he would return soon and become a distinguished knight. The boy asked the little prince if he would allow him to become his master. For Bari, it was enough that the boy grew up and became such a kind person. And sweet. The prince was glad to hear these words from the boy, whom he considered his older brother. He promised to become someone his older brother could be proud of. And Bari promised to quickly become a great knight and return home. After that, the boy left for the academy, and Ellie didn't even have time to say goodbye to him, and she was left completely alone. The girl stood in her and her brother's room and looked at how empty it had become. Nanny Marie entered the room and invited the girl for a short walk together. They were allowed to do this because the whole city was celebrating His Majesty's birthday. During the ruler's birthday celebration, all the shops in the kingdom decorated their doors with flowers. And in the evening, musicians came out to the street. Also in the capital during this period, security was increased so that the girls could walk together calmly. Ellie and Marie quickly got ready and went for a walk through the festive night city. The girls wandered through the market and approached different stalls with treats. At some point, they stopped staring at the small meat and vegetable kebabs. The sisters tried a kebab consisting of baked meat and corn. Then, Ellie saw a space where couples were dancing to the music. The girl grabbed her older sister's hand and dragged her towards the dancers. At that moment, the girl looked very happy and was smiling from ear to ear. The nanny took Ellie in her arms and spun her in a beautiful dance. They kept walking through the city when someone approached and called Marie. It turned out to be a teacher who helped the prince with his studies. He has been very busy with his students lately, so they hadn't seen each other in a long time. So, our nanny reminded us that this man was Yujez, the prince's teacher. The young man was very happy to meet his younger sister Marie. He handed the girl a small bouquet of flowers and offered to keep them company. Ellie immediately said she wanted to drink some fresh orange juice. But the nanny clearly dreamed of a large pitcher of cold light beer. Therefore, the whole company went to an establishment where they could buy all these drinks. The teacher offered to pay for the whole order, but the nanny began to resist. However, the teacher insisted, after which the guys began to discuss the latest news from each other's lives. Ellie looked at how good her older sister looked with this man by her side. Her eyes shimmered with her beauty and youth. Ellie still thought the count looked better, but she wasn't in a hurry to dismiss the teacher. The children were taught that if they noticed the adults were in a strange mood, they should leave them alone. Ellie remembered this and immediately decided to go to the bathroom and leave the guys alone. The nanny was surprised by her sister's behavior, but the teacher just laughed. Unlike Marie herself, Ellie was a very lively girl. She didn't run far, hid in the corner, and began to observe the situation. The teacher was the only son in the family, so he was jealous seeing such friendly families. He even admitted that sometimes he sees the prince as an angry little brother. Marie listened to stories about her little master and was amused, and Ellie observed the company from afar and thought they were having a great time together. She hoped that soon her beloved older sister would finally be happy. After all, finally someone has appeared who cares about her and shows her attention. Meanwhile, the count was examining his property papers and was worried about the proximity of an important day. This day meant the king's birthday and the prince's first visit to the palace. That's why the boy was so elegantly dressed and asked the nanny for an opinion on his appearance. Marie sincerely believed that the young master would be the most handsome of all present. She even said that the prince would be more handsome than his uncle, not hearing him approach from behind. The count was also dressed simply stunningly in his formal suit. Marie had to admit that today he looked much more handsome and stronger than usual. However, she didn't say it out loud, she was just joking. The prince tugged on the trouser leg of his uncle's light suit and asked him how he looked. The count slowly leaned towards the boy and gently took him by the arms. The man lifted the prince up and said he looked simply incredible. The nanny saw such a sweet interaction between relatives and was sincerely happy. However, the most important issue was not the prince's appearance. The count was the prime minister. That is why many nobles were afraid of him. Furthermore, the count officially announced his nephew as his successor, which led to strange conversations among the noble ladies. Everyone wondered which young lady would be lucky enough to marry him in the future. Among all these negative people, a ray of sunshine appeared in the form of a friend of the count. This man was his old acquaintance and also James's father. The young man arrived a little late, but still presented himself before the king. While the men were chatting, James told the prince that it was his mother who made them arrive on time. The boy's father didn't want him to talk about this on every corner, so he hurried to turn it into a joke. During this comical skirmish, a noble lady approached the young men and greeted them. The woman brought the girl, who was a little older than the prince, and introduced her as Isla. It was the first time the prince attended such an event, so the woman hoped the children would become friends. She wanted the boy to dance with her daughter, but he was too young for that. But the count clearly did not like the way the communication with the girl was imposed on him. Just because of the young man's angry look, all the guests turned away and went about their business. It was precisely because of this kind of interaction that the count hated socializing. People in this circle do not care at all about the well-being of children, and they use them for their own benefit. However, despite this, the count and his nephew still needed to bow before the king. His Majesty admired the good manners the prince displayed. However, the boy didn't listen to what they were telling him, because he was very passionate about one thing. Brielle couldn't take her eyes off the magnificent crown resting on the king's head. The boy told his uncle that the crown looked very heavy and that his neck would hurt. The man agreed with his nephew and even laughed a little. The king saw the smile on the count's face and realized it was caused by the boy's words. He addressed the prince directly and asked him to come closer. The boy looked at his uncle, who nodded to him as permission. Only after this did the young prince dare to take a few steps towards the king. However, what no one expected was that His Majesty would take April into his arms. The king lifted the boy and sat him on his lap, which surprised everyone present. Even the queen. The count did not expect this, and was completely furious and glared threateningly at His Majesty. After all, the huge and noisy banquet hall suddenly fell into a resounding silence. Kentril immediately jumped towards the king and took the boy from his lap. His Majesty said that the prince was very kind, so he couldn't resist. However, the count perfectly understood that this was not done by chance. In fact, the king had no brothers or heirs to the throne. Therefore, such an attitude towards the son of a noble was not perceived ambiguously, especially when this child is a distant relative of their queen. Such an incident could cause a real storm of concern among the nobles. Following this incident, the angry count left the palace without even saying goodbye. As a result, he refused to go to work and protested for several days. The nanny, Ellie, the count, and the prince were walking together through the city, so the merchant mistook them for his family. Marie wanted to explain the mistake to the woman, but the count ordered her not to. He simply pretended that they were actually a big family and asked for more food. The nanny tried to object to this, but the young man didn't want to hear anything. The prince decided to play along with his uncle. He turned to the girl and called the nanny mom. It happened so unexpectedly that Marie was speechless. The merchant said that both children strongly resembled their mother, so he gave them some extra food as a gift. Marie realized it was useless to explain anything, so she simply accepted it. The company went for a walk, and the prince looked at the surrounding families. Then I looked at my company and realized that they looked exactly the same. The prince liked to think of his nanny and Ellie as his real family. They were so happy and carefree that they didn't notice they were being watched the whole time. A man followed the group closely throughout the city. Some time later, the count was in his office when the butler knocked on his door. He brought a letter and announced that the young master had received an invitation. The man persistently advised me to attend this event, so it seemed like a nanny in her insistence. But in reality, the butler was only worried about his master's condition. The last time, the count demanded from the king to give every child the opportunity to sit on his lap as a condition for returning to work in the palace. Therefore, the palace worried whether their lord would really come to work on the appointed day. The count promised to think about it, but for now, he decided to take the opportunity to enjoy his rest. Although he had many agricultural-related jobs to do, he had the chance to be with his family. The butler noticed that recently, his master began to ask more and more about the nanny. Upon learning that the girl was already resting, the count also put aside his work. He announced that he also wanted to rest a little and asked them to bring tea to the garden. The butler was surprised that the count suddenly decided to rest and join the nanny. Marie was reading a book on the balcony and Kentril watched the girl from the side. He noticed that lately his dear nanny had been taking naps very often. The count asked his butler to bring a warm blanket and cover the girl. Before the maids had time to reach the neighboring balcony, the nanny fell face down on the table. However, even this did not wake her up, so he allowed the maid to cover her with a blanket. During her pleasant sleep, our Marie felt how warm she felt. After a while, when the sun had already begun to sink into the ground, the girl opened her eyes. She looked around and realized that a pillow and a blanket had appeared somewhere in front of her. Marie carefully released her shoulders and looked towards the hallway to see if anyone was behind the door. Suddenly, the girl thought there was someone a little ahead of her, around the corner. It was the butler who gently coughed into his fist, inviting her for a walk. The man politely invited the girl out to the garden and to lead her to a resting place. Marie immediately realized that this was not at all his usual behavior. The butler said that the count asked for the table to be removed and a pillow brought to him, and a blanket. The maids were so grateful to the girl that they made him happy. The butler noticed that the nanny is very kind to everyone on this estate, which is why everyone loves her. It was quite normal for workers to have good relationships with each other. However, despite this, the butler wanted to thank the girl separately. He believed that thanks to her, his master and prince began to smile much more often. The old butler sincerely believed that the nanny was definitely responsible for all this. He perfectly understood that it was precisely because of this feeling of joy that everyone loved the girl. A little later in the palace, the little prince was playing hide-and-seek and counting down. It took a lot of people to play, so the maid agreed to play with the children. Moreover, to achieve mass participation, the nanny and her younger sister Ellie took part in the game. Marie didn't know where to hide best so that it wouldn't be too difficult for the little one. The girl was lost in thought and didn't realize how she entered a large room. Marie was surprised by the number of books on the shelves. Suddenly, her attention focused on one particular book that stood out from the rest. The girl immediately went to the shelf and reached for the top shelf. It seemed strange to her that the first volume was on top, so Marie wanted to take it down. However, the book was too far away, so the girl lost her balance trying to grab it. She would definitely have fallen if the young count hadn't been behind her. The man helped Marie stay upright, although his sudden appearance scared her. Kentrell had been in the library for a long time, but the girl simply didn't notice him right away. The nanny explained that she was playing hide-and-seek with the prince and ended up here by accident. Marie became interested in the history of the kingdom, so she asked the count to recommend a book to her. The girl promised the gentleman that someday she would definitely know even more than he knew. After all, this was nothing compared to the exams she had to take at the university in her world. The count looked at the girl and was horrified because he thought about how much he liked her. The young man quickly turned around and decided to quickly change the subject of conversation. Marie said she was hiding easily on purpose, but the boy never came to look for her. That's why she intended to go herself to the initial meeting place. The girl had her back to the window, so the count noticed that something was approaching them through the glass. It turned out he was right, because a second later, the window shattered loudly. Reacting at lightning speed, the young man grabbed the nanny by the shoulders and squeezed her against him. This way, he managed to protect the young woman from fragments and blows. Surprised, both fell to the ground, allowing the attacker to escape. Marie was lying on the carpet with her eyes closed, and something warm was dripping onto her face. The girl was the first to come to her senses, and abruptly opening her eyes, she saw blood on her master. The girl looked at the count and saw that he had a large cut on his forehead. The count looked around and saw that a large arrow was sticking out of the wall. First of all, he asked about the nanny's condition, because she was trembling a lot. The man immediately realized that this was an attack aimed at one of them. A minute later, the butler burst into the room, whom the count asked to take Marie to a safe place. He ordered the rest to immediately close all entrances and exits of the palace and its grounds. Only then did Marie realize that a huge arrow was sticking out of the wall. The girl realized that it could have easily killed one of them. The butler sent several guards to help escort Marie to her room. The count only placed trusted people in the building, so it was safe there. However, the girl was still worried and trembling from what she had seen earlier. The gentleman noticed that the nanny was very worried about what happened. Therefore, the man asked the girl to stay with Eli, so that they would not leave her alone. And he himself went to patrol the palace and its surroundings. Marie was worried that because of her, not only the prince, but also the count were in danger. All this could have been avoided if she had read part of the original about the culprit. Then small children, who didn't know what happened, burst into the room. The nanny didn't want to scare the children, so she didn't show what happened. She said that she just felt a little unwell, probably because she had overeaten. Ellie offered to pat her sister on the back, and the prince held her hand. Marie. It was very nice that the little children cared and worried so much about her. But there was no time to worry. The girl decided to focus on what she could influence. As long as our Marie felt the warmth of the children, she had nothing to fear in this world. However, even after 2 days, the criminal still had not been caught. The teacher was walking through the count's palace when little Ellie crossed his path. The young man called the girl over and greeted her politely. Ellie immediately recognized him as the same stranger from the market and approached the man. The girl thought that the prince had no classes today, so she was surprised to see the teacher. In fact, Yuge's arrived to say that he had passed his exams, so classes would be held less frequently. Ellie, who hoped for her sister's relationship with the teacher, was very upset by this. The man immediately noticed that there was some kind of disorder in the palace, but the girl knew nothing about it. She realized it herself, but neither the count nor her sister told her anything. The teacher wanted to greet Nanny Marie, but the little prince distracted him. He ran up to the young man and asked him to explain several incomprehensible things. There might not have been a class today, but the boy couldn't wait until the next one. The prince did this on purpose, to prevent the teacher and the nanny from meeting. Odds and Brielle went to the opposite end of the palace, so Ellie felt uncomfortable alone. The girl decided to try again, to ask the count everything, and approached him. She carefully called out to the gentleman's room and asked permission to enter. Ellie said she urgently needed to tell the Count something important. She explained that she had seen a strange man just a few days ago. There was a small secret hole in the garden behind the mansion, a passage right behind a large tree. The Count explained that the mansion is rebuilt every year and the garden is always guarded, so any outsider would be caught. However, Ellie said that the suspicious person was from internal security. She saw him when playing hide-and-seek with the prince, so she thought the man was one of the players. Then the girl fell silent for several minutes, hesitant, fidgeting with the sweets in her hands. She remembered the Count's words that the prince could only trust her, and the nanny when the Count was away. The man said they were family, so the girl wanted to help. The young Count was impressed by little Ellie's determination and reflected on her words. The little girl hoped that this information would help find the criminal. Cantrell placed his hand on the girl's shoulder and thanked her for the important clue. He sincerely believed that this information would be of great help to him in finding the shooter. The Count asked the name of that strange man, after which he went to his office to think about the clue. That day, he thought that the arrow was not aimed at him, but was clearly intended for Marie. However, he didn't understand at all why the girl was in danger. The Count understood that she might well be hiding some important information from him. However, he also remembered all the actions the nanny had done before. There were many questions, but at least the girl he saw was Marie. The Count was firmly convinced that she would never harm the prince. He approached the window and looked down with a smile at the group frolicking there. Marie, her younger sister Ellie, and the young prince were having fun together in the street. Next to them, the little one looked truly happy. Some time later, Marie took the medicine and went to the Count to treat the cuts on his face. The girl asked him to tell her what had happened recently. The Count explained that with Ellie's help, they caught the criminal, who turned out to be a knight. He was caught and is now being interrogated in prison, but the guy never confessed. Ellie was very attentive and immediately realized that something strange was going on. Marie realized that children are always smarter than they look at first glance. The Count stopped in front of our dear girl and looked at her intently. He remembered Derek's words that clearly something was wrong with Marie if they were trying to kill her. At some point, the Count even decided to ask the girl everything directly. In the last second, he fell silent and couldn't say another word. The young man still didn't dare to ask the questions that interested him. Instead, he said that he had assigned the most trustworthy of all his knights to the prince. Now Taylor will personally take care of young Lord Briel. The Count did not understand why the nanny didn't tell him why they wanted to kill her. He thought they weren't close enough or simply weren't aware of the whole situation. He said that if he had known the girl was in danger, he would have been more careful. However, Marie noticed that she only fell and scratched herself. Mostly, everything was fine. The Count silently bent down and took a jar of wound medicine. He knelt in front of the girl and began to carefully treat her abrasions. Marie was surprised that the Count personally attended to her wounds. The girl suddenly blushed from so much attention and care from Cantrell. The Count said that Ellie was very worried about her older sister and asked to see how she was. After which, he covered the girl's wound with a band-aid and sent her to the estate. Finally, Marie turned around and sincerely thanked the Count for taking care of her. The man remained standing on one knee for some time in front of the bench, where the girl had just been sitting. A little later, already in pajamas, the girls were sitting in their room. Ellie hugged her stuffed bunny, and Marie stroked her head. The girl said she had been quite scared for the last few days. After all, she sincerely thought the man was just a very good gentleman. A suspicious man who came and went through the legal loophole often watched Ellie and Bari before they moved in with the Count. Every time Marie came home late from work, the man was with the children. She trusted him. The girl apologized to her sister for paying little attention to her and putting her in danger. However, she noticed that her older sister handles her responsibilities well. She cooks delicious food, buys new clothes, sends letters to her brother, and much more. Marie was glad that the girl remembered even those small things and appreciated them. In the original story, Ellie couldn't be happy because she was the sister of a criminal. That's why, in this life, the stranger wanted to give the girl everything she truly deserved. Marie, without saying anything, silently hugged Ellie tightly by the shoulders, pressing her against her. At first, she thought about protecting only the prince, but now she was very happy to be able to help her brother too. And her sister. She will definitely make sure that no one dares to harm them in this life. But for that, the girl first had to tell her story to the Count. All night she lay in bed and thought whether the Count would believe her words or hate her. At the same time, Kentrell also had a vivid dream with memories of his childhood. That day, he was running through the meadow. He stumbled and fell onto the damp ground. Someone's big, strong hand wanted to help him up from the cold grass. And wet. It was his older brother, who was dazzlingly beautiful that day. The little one could walk by himself, but his older brother wanted to carry him on his back. At that moment, he hugged his brother tightly by the neck and became very happy. They walked through the field in silence for a while, when suddenly the boy realized something. He realized that he was actually watching a dream that he could independently control. Then the young Kentrell hugged his older brother tightly by the shoulders. He admitted that he misses him a lot and dreams of talking to him at least one more time. The boy began to talk about what was happening to him at that moment. He also added that his nephew is safe and sound. Gradually, the Count's older brother began to melt in the sun and disappear from his dream. The next moment, the young man woke up in bed with tears in his eyes. Sitting on his chest was little Prince Briel with his cute pajama hat. The Count still remembered the feelings he experienced in his dream towards his older brother. So he hugged his nephew very tightly and squeezed him against his chest. The little one immediately felt that something had happened to his uncle. However, he said that he just missed his little prince. The boy admitted that he hit his uncle in the face so that he would wake up and stop crying. He apologized for this and offered to blow on the impact site. The Count leaned a little closer and put his face under little Abriel's breath. Immediately after this, he felt better. The man even took the prince in his arms and vomited him out. A little later, he invited the nanny and the children to the great hall and played the piano for them. Marie could not let the children go outside due to the threat of danger, so she was with them the whole time. To prevent the children from getting bored, the Count decided to entertain them with his game. The man was happy, because after a long time he could still play well. Ellie and the little prince greatly enjoyed the young Count's performance. They even approached the man and sincerely applauded him. Marie was also delighted with the delicious melody Kendrell played for them. The prince pulled the nanny's skirt and asked if she knew how to play the instrument. The girl remembered that when she worked as a teacher, she learned several children's songs just out of interest. However, she was afraid of looking strange if she started playing them on such a high-quality instrument. That's why the girl pretended not to know how to play the piano. However, the young Count decided to teach the children a few simple melodies. Marie. It seemed like a second ago her younger sister looked very suspicious. However, at this moment, she was still smiling and having fun with the little prince. The girl seemed very excited about the melody and learning a new skill. So the nanny cleared the suspicions from her head and decided not to think about it. Sometime later, in the middle of the night, several people in dark cloaks were found in the forest. Earl and Taylor came to find out the information that the tracker had gathered for them. Derek talked about what he had recently learned about the topic that interested them. However, nothing was known about the criminal knight so far. The man never opened his mouth, so there was no point in continuing to threaten him. However, during a search of his house, a suspicious letter was found. Unfortunately, due to the code, it was impossible to say exactly what it said. The Count said that upon returning to the mansion, he would have to hand over the investigation to Taylor again. Derek intervened in the conversation and asked if the Count had thought about his words. The man did not want to recall this conversation, but said that he had considered this option. The Count commented that he could fully trust the young prince's nanny. The knight did not know the girl so closely, so he offered to put some pressure on her. However, the Count said that if the girl had wanted to, she could have harmed the prince a long time ago. But instead, Marie cared about the boy as much as he did, so he trusted her completely. There was something suspicious about her, but she was definitely not behind the attack. In fact, the Count was even curious to know how much the girl wanted to protect the prince. That's why he asked his knights to take care of her if something happened to her. Take care not only of the girl, but also of her family, consisting of a brother and a younger sister. The Count trusted these two knights, so he asked them for this favor personally. Both knights unconditionally obeyed their master, so they promised to fulfill this order. Some time later, the nanny and Ellie were sitting on the grand staircase waiting for guests. Ellie was so eager for their arrival that she even marked the days on the calendar. It was today that her older brother Bari was supposed to return from vacation. Finally, after a while, a carriage entered the estate. Ellie immediately jumped abruptly from her seat and ran towards her brother. The nanny was touched because her brother had grown so much that he was now returning home with friends. The children were bored, so everything turned out well. New faces are always cool. The carriage door opened, and Bari appeared, who had grown during his absence. Ellie was very happy to see her brother, but Mary was frozen in surprise when she saw her friend. Following the boy, another boy of his age got out of the carriage. Bari introduced everyone to his friend from the academy, named Zig Kyler. In fact, this was not the first time Marie had heard this name and seen this guy. This silver-haired, blue-eyed boy was the main character of the original story. In the novel, he is described as a guy with hair shining like threads in the sun, a young man of truly divine beauty. Zig Kyler was the main protagonist of the novel that the outsider was reading in her world. However, this was not all that could surprise people. It was this young man who killed the little prince's uncle at the end of the story. Knight Taylor was impressed that Bari's friend ranked third in the fencing academy. Just by looking at his rough hand for marking, he realized that this guy was an unusual person. He is the friend of the nanny's brother. His character is not bad, but for some reason, the girl was on guard. Recently, her native kingdom took the form of an absolute monarchy, and there are many more noble families, so nothing is known about many of them yet. That's why the young knight didn't remember anyone from the Kohler family. He only realized that their family came precisely from the people of this plane. The knight was interested in seeing his student after a long break, and at that moment, the nanny offered to serve the children some juice so they could rest after the trip. The girl had no idea that the main character of the novel could become friends with her younger brother. In the original story, Bari died very early, without even having a sword in his hands. After drinking some juice, the young man asked the girl where he could meet the count. He promised not to take up much of his time. He just wanted to thank him for the invitation. Marie said that it was better for the young people to relax now, but instead, she invited everyone to have dinner together. Ellie noticed that her older sister was acting a little suspicious. At that moment, the little prince was hiding from everyone in his favorite treehouse. He was very angry at all those people who surrounded him on this terrible day. Everyone had been ignoring him lately, so the prince was waiting for this commotion to subside. His whole family and friends went to welcome the new guest without him. Taylor wanted to enter the house, but the princess forbade him because the count made this house only for him. Instead, he turned around in the dampness and hugged his favorite toy with tears in his eyes. In fact, he just wanted to play with his beloved older brother. The boy felt that all the adults were hiding something from him. He hoped that, when he grew up as big as Bari, they would stop being secretive. The knight asked the nanny for help, who saw the prince in the treehouse from afar. However, at that moment the boy was kicking the ground with his feet and looked very amused and angry at the same time. The adults realized that the prince was angry with them because he wasn't being carried away by them. But instead of persuasion, the nanny decided to try another tactic to convince the prince. The little one didn't understand why everyone around him fell silent and stopped calling him. Suddenly, next to him, he heard strange sounds. The prince opened his eyes and saw that the nanny had climbed onto a tree branch next to him. The girl admitted that, when she was a child, she often climbed trees, so she didn't need a ladder. The prince was so delighted with his nanny that for a second he forgot that she had offended him. Marie said that she needs to get to know the people she knows gradually. Although the boy was still angry, the girl couldn't stop being moved by him. However, suddenly a loud creak was heard, and the branch under the nanny began to shake. It couldn't bear the weight of the girl, and Marie fell. She was already preparing for the impact when someone caught her in his arms at the last moment. Marie opened her eyes and saw that she was in the arms of the young Count of Cantrell. The man carefully put the girl down on the ground and asked her if she was injured. The knights and servants immediately rushed to them to help and check their condition. From this incident, even the little prince decided to stop being offended and come down to his treehouse. The count told the boy to be careful, otherwise he might fall like his nanny. The prince looked at his uncle and asked where this garden came from. The man admitted that he watched from all the windows and worried about the nanny when she climbed the tree. Marie saw the sweat running down the count's neck and realized that he was rushing towards them. Meanwhile, Brielle admitted that she would like to see the new guest. After which, the count invited everyone to lunch together and get acquainted. The nanny and the gentleman calmed down, because now the prince had stopped feeling offended by them. A little later, in the castle, Ellie and little Abriel spent some time together. Suddenly, the girl said something that made the boy freeze with his mouth open. He didn't even believe it the first time, so he asked if he had correctly heard the new information. It turned out that the next day was supposed to be the birthday of their beloved nanny Marie. A small child approached Ellie and asked what gift she had prepared. The girl showed a beautiful white hat with a blue ribbon. She realized that her sister would be happy even if the boy simply congratulated her. However, the prince was not satisfied with this situation, so he ran to ask his uncle for help. Brielle said that tomorrow is the birthday of his favorite nanny. He really wanted to give her some gift, but he had very little time. That's why the Count and Eli suggested going to the market together and choosing something. The next day, when Marie entered the living room, festive ribbons fell from everywhere, and firecrackers started to burst. Her relatives and friends began to take turns congratulating the girl on her birthday. The younger siblings were the first to approach and hand over their gifts in boxes. Next came the prince, and said that he had been choosing this gift for a long time together with his uncle. They couldn't choose just one thing, so they gifted several chandeliers and small candles. The boy knew that his nanny loved scented candles, so he took everything. Marie joked that she wouldn't have time to use all these candles for the rest of her life. Everyone had a great time with the atmosphere surrounding them. The last time the girl didn't even use the brooch the Count gave her, so this time she decided to buy her a dream catcher. Marie admitted that she liked the brooch. She was just afraid of hurting the little prince. The Count was glad that the girl really liked his first gift. For a moment he felt so embarrassed that he blushed and turned away. There was still a whole mountain of gifts ahead that needed to be unpacked. The next one to open was Ellie's gift, which contained a hat, which her older sister immediately liked. Taylor and Bari were also happy to be able to please her with their gifts. As a sign of gratitude, Marie even bowed and kissed the little prince on the cheek. The boy really liked this, so in response, he also kissed the nanny on the cheek. It was a wonderful day, full of happiness, joy, and fun. In the parents' past life, the girls didn't get along, because they had to marry because of her. Therefore, she didn't remember the last time she was congratulated wholeheartedly. The girl tried to forget this day, because it seemed to her that it didn't belong to her at all. Then she found herself in someone else's body, but now the stranger changed her mind. Because thanks to all these people surrounding her, she wanted to celebrate her birthday and look forward to the next day with joy. A little later, Marie went to her room and put on a new dress in honor of the holiday. She also put on a new hat and twirled around with it in front of her sister. The girl decided to take a walk in the city, even though lately they had not been allowed to leave the mansion. She didn't want to admit who she was going with, but said it was a very close person. Ellie couldn't believe that people dressed so beautifully for a meeting with someone they had just met. The girl sincerely hoped that her sister would find her love. However, she was mistaken, because Marie did not go to meet her lover. In fact, she really wanted to see the prince's former nanny, Erin. It had been almost a year since they had seen each other, so they were happy to meet. Marie said that the prince was growing up to be a wonderful person, and that he would grow up to be a handsome man. The woman noticed that the girl was very well dressed, so she suggested she should have a date with someone. She advised young Marie to rest well and visit her more often. Today the girl had a day off, so she wanted to have dinner with Erin. Suddenly, someone at the next table caught the attention of our nanny. Prince Yuge's young master had just sat down there and also noticed Marie. The man was astonished by how beautiful the girl looked. They exchanged a few phrases in greeting, while Erin watched from the sidelines. The woman immediately decided to bring the young people together and invited the boy to sit at their table. She clearly wanted to fix up the personal life of her young friend. The teacher did not refuse and gladly decided to accompany the two ladies to dinner. Furthermore, the young man did not forget to praise the nanny's appearance. Erin was very happy to be able to get these two to spend time together. Meanwhile, in the palace, the head maid was taking care of the children. Ellie was reading a book when the prince approached her and asked where the nanny had sneaked off to. In the same room with them was the Count, who was drinking tea and reading documents. When Ellie said that her sister had sneaked off for a date, the Count was so surprised that he spilled his tea. The man did not expect at all that Marie could have a date with a young man. The Count even approached the children and asked where their nanny had gone for a walk. And with whom? His younger sister said she had no idea where Marie went for a walk or with whom. The little prince was not satisfied with this answer, so he tried to take the book away from the girl and blackmail her into giving more details. He said that Marie belonged to him and he didn't want to share her with anyone. The Count remembered that, when the girl asked for permission to go for a walk, she looked very cheerful. Ellie said that her sister went for a walk with a close friend. After these words, the Count sank even deeper and fell into true discouragement. This behavior did not escape Ellie's keen eye, who immediately understood everything. A young knight was running at full speed through the long corridor of the mansion. It was Taylor who approached the Count and told him that he had found a nanny in the city. He spent some time near the market, where there were many knights who could protect her if something happened. However, Taylor saw in the Count's eyes that he was demanding more information. He added that there was a man next to her, but in reality, at that moment, Aaron simply went to the restroom. From his master's face, the knight immediately guessed what he was thinking. The young Count could not control his emotions, which was ugly on his part. He should have congratulated his nanny if he had really known about her true love, because otherwise, it would turn out that the man neglects her feelings. However, at the mere thought of Marie, a sweet image of her appeared in the Count's head, and his heart immediately began to beat very fast and agitate him. The man realized that he did not want to lose the girl. He did not want to let her go. However, he could not do anything if his feelings were not reciprocated. Moreover, he could not do anything if the girl already had a lover. The Count looked out the window and saw how happily Marie was returning to the estate. At that moment, he felt some despair and even anger at himself. Meanwhile, the girl suspected nothing and told the butler about her walk. Before she had time to enter the mansion, the children immediately ran towards her. The prince grabbed the girl's dress and asked her if she really had a date. The young master said that his sister Ellie told him about this. Marie laughed and said that she went to meet her ex-nanny Erin. She promised that she would never abandon the little prince and asked him not to cry anymore. The girl also suggested that next time, they should go to a meeting together. Marie knew that her sister would misunderstand everything, and she worried that the Count had also found out. For the next few days, the young man completely avoided any meetings or communication with the girl. When she wanted to talk to him about the prince, he left everything to her discretion. Marie was a little upset by his behavior, which did not go unnoticed. Barry and Ellie were arguing about how the young Earl really liked his sister. Otherwise, he wouldn't have worried about her date, because even on her birthday, he couldn't take his eyes off her. Ellie was sure that there was something more than simple goodwill there. The girl was angry because her older brother did not take her words seriously. Even the Count himself trusted her words more than his relatives and friends. After this, Barry admitted that even he was scared by the stories about the criminal. After these words, Ellie got upset because she was really scared at that moment. My brother said that she would be very strong if she could endure all this. However, even after these words, the girl seemed depressed and confused. Then Barry asked if he should stay at the mansion instead of returning to the academy. But Ellie noticed that the boy is not even capable of protecting himself, so let him go study. And he will protect her when he can grow up and become very strong. At that moment, the dear nanny was in the garden doing household chores. The girl looked at the clear sun and rejoiced at the good weather. She didn't understand why the Count constantly ignored her after her date. It was unlikely to be because of her, but still it was necessary to ask the man directly. She would be very embarrassed if she suddenly told about this misunderstanding, but it turned out that the matter was completely different. Therefore, Marie considered it useless to tell such nonsense to a busy person. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange sound not far from her and realized that someone was sitting in the bushes. She collected flowers so that she could return to the mansion. After the recent events, Marie felt uncomfortable at the slightest suspicion of danger. The girl was heading towards the house when something caught her attention. The nanny approached and saw a note lying on the bench. There was only one word written on it, but it seriously scared the girl. This little note reminded our heroine that she was a traitor. An empty garden, a sudden note. It seemed to the girl that she had identified all the dangerous people on the Count's estate. However, this was her last warning. Someone could harm the prince at any moment. If the girl continues like this, she might lose him. Despite the Count's possible distrust, Marie decided to tell the truth. That's why the girl called the young man's office and asked to come in. The Count, who had been avoiding the nanny lately, immediately became cautious. He remembered how stupid he had been in recent days and didn't know what to do now. He didn't have the courage to meet the girl yet, so he asked her to come next time if it wasn't urgent. However, the situation was urgent, so Marie opened the door and entered. The nanny stood on the threshold, with a note in her hands and tears rolling down her cheeks. The Count immediately noticed the state the girl appeared in front of him. He jumped from his seat and asked her what happened. The nanny approached the young man and told him that the children were fine. The problem was hers. With trembling hands, she handed the Count a note she had found in the garden. The girl said that some unknown person left this secret note for her. The young man accepted the paper, addressed to the traitor from Marie's hands. It was at that very moment that the girl admitted that she was a traitor. If the nanny had betrayed the Count, no one would have had any reason to leave this note. It was then that he realized that Derek's suspicions were not unfounded. He asked directly if the girl was colluding with those who threatened her family. Marie was very afraid to reveal the secret. She kept crying, but still found the strength to speak. She asked the Count if she had ever seemed strange to him. The girl noticed that the young man was very attentive, especially towards the young master. Therefore, she asked him if he felt how in an instant she seemed to turn into a different person. The Count did not understand where Marie was leading, but it was very important to her. Therefore, the young man remained silent for a while and really thought about her words. He remembered the first time he checked her resume with his butler. The girl had experience working with children, so the man ordered that she be hired as a nanny. However, during all this time, he continued to secretly observe the girl in the first days of her work. Seeing how the little prince wouldn't stop crying and rejected the girl, the Count began to think. Many times he worried whether he had made the right decision, because the little prince cried all the time, and he didn't want to go into his nanny's arms. However, at one point, little Brielle suddenly started smiling and approached the girl. Even then, the Count began to suspect a sharp change in character. From that moment on, there wasn't a day when the prince didn't smile. And then, the Count thought that there was no problem anymore. But at the same time, he clearly felt that the girl had become different. This is exactly what he told Nanny Marie now. Answering his question, the girl promised the Count that she would tell him an incredible story that was completely true. After that, she began to tell the young man facts from her childhood that no one should have known. Marie read all this in her book, which she found in another world. The girl didn't know how much she needed to tell the Count for him to believe her. In the end, she described her secret assistant Derek, even his appearance. No one knew about him except the butler and tailor, so this information was enough for the Count. The story the girl told for hours, in a trembling voice, was incredible. The young man could not believe that this whole world was just the plot of a book, and the real Nanny Marie was a hired killer meant to eliminate the prince. But someone else possessed her. After this, the Count asked why the real Marie wanted to kill Brielle, and who ordered her to do it. However, the outsider admitted that all this was explained after the incident, so she also did not know the motives or the identity of the client. She appeared in a parallel story, but the girl hadn't read up to that point. She kept crying all the time and was very exhausted and worn out. Therefore, the young Count gently hugged the girl and tried to calm her down. He admitted that the young nanny went through a very difficult time when she found herself in a strange world, and decided to protect the prince. After a while, the girl calmed down more or less and regained her senses. The Count said that now both he and the little prince are fine, so there is nothing to worry about. The girl was afraid that Kentrell would hate her because she tried to kill his nephew. But the man understood that if she were still planning the assassination attempt, she wouldn't have told him anything. A dubious story, rather a lie. But the girl's trembling showed that it was pure truth. Still, he couldn't hate the outsider, so he asked her what her real name was. After which, he said that Irene is indeed a very sensitive girl. The Count noticed that all this time, she must have been very lonely. After all, in her past life, she probably had close people, relatives, and friends. However, the outsider remembered that her parents were always busy at work. She also didn't remember the faces of her friends because they never managed to see each other. She had no good memories, so she didn't understand why she was crying. But if she could meet her friends again, she would like to talk to them as if they had never parted. The girl admitted that she missed all her relatives and friends, with whom she had little contact, after which she fainted from exhaustion. The Count carried the poor nanny to her room, laid her on the bed, and called the doctor. The girl did not regain consciousness for 3 whole days. All this time, Ellie was by her older sister's side. Everyone was in such a terrible state that even the older brother asked the girl to rest a little. He went to have a small snack, after which the girl had to go to bed. The last few days had been difficult for all of them with Marie in such a serious condition. The boy looked at his sister and realized that if this continued, she would end up in a hospital bed next. In fact, Ellie noticed some oddities in her older sister. For example, she said she didn't know how to play the piano, although before she could do it very well. And the brooch she received from an important person she hasn't worn for a long time. And from some point, my sister started smiling every time he called her by name. The girl explained that the young knight might get hurt if he wore that brooch all the time. The nanny kept saying that she loved both the prince and her siblings very much. However, Ellie understood that all this time was a complete lie, because the sister kept saying that the prince and she herself were a way to earn money. In difficult days, she would come home angry and say that she wouldn't have returned to life like this if everything had been different. Therefore, the girl did not understand why her sister was lying and why she was pretending to be happy. Although it seemed strange to her, Ellie continued to be a good little sister. Girl, she pretended because she didn't want to be abandoned again. However, the girl seemed too sincere. It was hard to believe that all this was a lie. From some point on, Marie started looking at the girl with great warmth and stopped yelling at her. Ellie even believed it was an angel who had come down from heaven to replace her sister. Thus the days passed. Months followed one another, turning into years. Over time, these things ceased to have special significance for the girl. No matter who her older sister was, she became her true family. But after fainting, she changed suddenly, so Ellie feared that Marie would leave her. That's why the girl tried to spend as much time as possible with her older sister. She cried all the time and hoped Marie would come back to her. The Count watched from afar the behavior of the nanny's younger sister, remembered that she behaved exactly the same way with his older brother in his dream. Then the young man became convinced that the girl was sincerely attached to her older sister. He himself was very worried about the girl because he still felt tenderness for her. Immediately after this, the Count headed to his study, where they were already waiting for him. Derek bowed to his master and reported his arrival. He immediately felt that there was a very strange atmosphere in the mansion and asked what had happened. After which, the Count told him the story of how the nanny lost consciousness, and she didn't regain it for several days. The secret assistant admitted that he had almost finished fulfilling his master's last order. He arrived just in time, because it was impossible to wait any longer for the enemy to appear. The little prince went every day to visit his nanny, and worried that she might get sick because of him. After all the people he loves leave him sooner or later, like what happened with Mom. And Dad. The knight was annoyed that evil people told such unpleasant things to a small child. That's why he tried to calm the prince and told him it wasn't his fault. He said that there are truly evil people, but the prince is not one of them. Without a doubt, he even swore the young master the sincerity of his words. After that, he lifted the boy in his arms and helped him get onto the bed with the nanny. There the young prince settled in and opened his notebook. The boy could have rested today, but he still wrote because he was afraid of forgetting everything he wanted to tell Marie. The uncle said the girl was fine, but the boy knew he was lying because he was trembling. They say in the mansion that there is a suspicious person who has been following them. Everyone whispers among themselves, but they hide it from the prince because he is still too small. That's why the boy wanted to grow up quickly and help everyone. He was very sad because now all he could do was play and study. He didn't want to say that he wouldn't go to fencing and writing classes, so he asked Marie to get up quickly. And after waking up, go with her to Erin, as she promised, and then go for a walk with his uncle, Ellie and Bari. A lot of time had passed, so the prince asked if he could stay with the nanny a little longer. However, the knight noticed that the girl needed to rest and recover, so it was better for them to leave. The boy was upset, but he understood that his nanny's health was the priority now. The knight took the prince in his arms and then took his notebook from the bed. He was worried that if this continued, the boy would grow up too fast. 5 days after Marie lost consciousness, she regained her senses. One fine morning, she woke up and everyone rushed to visit her. The little prince was so happy about his nanny's recovery that he even burst into tears. All her close friends came to rejoice, after which the mansion filled with laughter again. After some time, the girl became strong enough to go out into the yard for a walk. She was found there by the Count, who informed her that the little prince had lost his nanny. The young man wanted the girl to rest more, as she had just woken up. And as a security measure, she did not go beyond the yard guarded by Derek. The Count was upset because the girl would not listen to him at all. However, he decided to ask her to fulfill one of his requests. Marie grabbed the Count's face with her hands and said that she had lost a lot of weight. That's why he himself needed to rest more and worry less. After her recent awakening, Marie seemed very cheerful and happy. Cantrell was very worried that something might be wrong and the girl might lose consciousness again. He did not want to remind her of those sad events, but they needed to continue the conversation. He asked why exactly, after her explanation, she fainted. The man admitted that he did not have time to tell her everything he wanted, and the atmosphere around them suddenly became like love. The count thought that the girl was going on a date, so he said he would bless her, but he asked her to stay with the prince until he grows up, after which the girl admitted that the last time she went to meet Aaron. And next time, she promised to visit her with the prince. She explained that Brielle felt offended because she went to see Aaron alone with the hat Ali gave her. The girl looked at the count and prayed that he would understand her insinuations. Only after that did the young man understand what she was trying to explain to him. The count realized that it was not a date at all, but a trip to visit an old friend. After that, he realized how foolish he had been lately and how badly he had behaved. Out of great shame, the young man moved away from the nanny so as not to show her his face. Since leaving the count's estate is currently forbidden, he recommended sending a letter to Aaron. After this explanation, the young master's heart felt lighter. He also noticed that Nanny Marie was also very embarrassed by what was happening. The count felt so foolish that he even covered his face with his hands. However, now he knew that the path was open for him, and he decided to act. The first thing he did was take off his jacket and throw it over the girl's shoulders. Even during the day, the patient may be cold, so he decided to take care of the nanny. Marie felt embarrassed by this display of affection from her master. The two young people separated side by side and looked into each other's eyes. There was a romantic atmosphere around them. However, it was suddenly destroyed by the sharp cries of the children. The prince was looking for his nanny, so the count and Marie abruptly moved away in different directions. The young man promised his nephew that he would help him find a nanny, so he let her go with him. The girl was very happy that everything had gone well for them lately. She looked happy. Some time later, Jason came to visit them and gave Marie a bag of sweets and cookies. It was a small, sweet gift in honor of her recovery, and also payment for the cat doll the girl made him last time. This gratitude went straight to the nanny's heart, so the little prince began to feel jealous. He held today's pudding in his hands, which he was also going to give to his beloved Marie. The girl said that the food was especially delicious because it was a gift. The nanny heard that young Master Jason argued with his sister Ciela again. It all happened because of a toy that was the boy's favorite. The prince commented that if he had a younger sister, he would give her books, sweets, etc. Then, Jason asked his friend if he could give Miss Bear to her. At that moment, the prince hesitated, and then the conversation turned into a small argument. While the children were playing, their father and uncle were discussing their problems. They met in the garden over a cup of aromatic tea and talked. There were rumors that the count's residence was under special protection, so his friend was worried. He even asked the count if he could offer him any help. Baron Jake was an old friend and a strong ally who would always be by Cantrell's side. However, he also has his own son, so it was impossible to drag him into this fight. The count refused help, but the Baron realized that the main problem was his stubbornness. He sighed deeply and said that the young man almost always refuses any help. However, he added that he could count on him in any case if he suddenly needed something. The count thanked his friend for his trust and hoped that Jake would take care of the prince if everyone was in danger. However, nothing was clear yet. First, it was necessary to find evidence. The circle of suspects gradually narrowed. It all started with those who benefited the most from the death of the prince's parents. At that moment, one of the nobles bowed to the king, greeting his majesty. The head of the country clearly knew this man well. He even asked him how he was. It was the king's father-in-law and the queen's father, Cabrin, who lived well thanks to the sovereign's favor. The man turned to his majesty and asked if he had heard the latest news. There were rumors that something strange had happened at the prime minister's mansion. The king said with a smile on his face that he had heard these local rumors, but seeing his father-in-law's enthusiasm, he assumed it was alarming news for him. The man tried not to show his concern and said that he only wanted to protect his nephew. The king kept smiling, but his whole body only showed aggression. After all, to preserve his throne, he sent his young nephew into exile. After these words, all the servants present suddenly tensed up, and they felt uncomfortable. The king's father-in-law immediately realized that he had said this specifically to demonstrate his strength, making those around him realize his political weakness. This was a silent order to support the king, because his actions cannot be criticized. The queen could only watch from the side what was happening in the throne room of her castle. The girl turned to her father and asked him to tell her more about what happened. At first, His Majesty did not interfere in their conversation and only observed where he could lead them. Introduce them. Then, the man asked his wife not to pretend she knew nothing and not to turn her back on helping her father. The girl tried to justify herself, but the king raised his hand ordering her to be quiet. He realized that relatives were very similar to each other, even in their actions. The queen had no choice but to remain silent and sadly watch what was happening. The father-in-law said that he had urgent matters, so he asked permission to take his leave. The young king allowed him to leave and also sent his wife out of the hall. Near the exit, the father-in-law placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder as a sign of support. He could not tell her anything, only show her his love and care in this way. The maids noticed that the queen worked tirelessly for 2 weeks to get here, but in the end everything ended quickly, so everyone felt very sorry for the queen. Meanwhile, on the count's estate, Sig and Bari spent time in the stables. The boys were on vacation from their studies at the fencing academy. Sig learned about the incident on the estate, but now they could safely return to the academy. The nanny's brother realized that there was none of that, just a bunch of piled-up things. However, now everything is safe, although at first the boy was afraid to leave his sisters here. A few days before their departure, he overheard an alarming conversation between the count and the butler. Cantrell immediately guessed that the boy approached him to say that he would not go to the academy. He understood that the boy was worried about his beloved sisters. Ellie is still just a child, although Marie says she is fine, but the boy is worried about them. That's why he thought about staying on the estate. However, the count noticed that Ellie may look like a baby, but she is stronger than everyone thinks. But if she goes to the academy, instead of just helping, she will also be able to protect them. Therefore, the count advised the boy to study, and he himself promised to take care of the girls. He patted him on the head and advised him not to worry and to concentrate on his studies. After these words, the boy calmed down a little and decided to trust the count, or simply insisted on entering the academy, or the sisters wanted the boy to graduate. Zeke noticed that he would be bored alone, so he was glad that Bari was with him. The boy was worried that his sister would not get better and wanted the vacation to be a little longer. His friend, on the contrary, wanted the vacation to be at least a little shorter. Although he was not so diligent, he still diligently prepared for all the classes. He was an outstanding student and could have graduated from the academy early, but he didn't know what to do next. Now he was happy with everything, but it was hard for him to think about finishing his studies. And the inheritance. Bari couldn't understand this, because a friend had previously said that second sons had nothing to worry about. The boy said with a cheerful smile on his face that it was still true. Bari was the first person who told him that he was a playboy. The boy knew that his friend was proud that he was a handsome genius, but this time he promised to surpass him and move on to the next grade. Sig, indeed, considered his friend very sincere, but thought that he was completely satisfied with his abilities. At first he thought that the boy was a hard-working noble from an impoverished family. He had to protect them, so he wanted to become stronger quickly for their sake. When the boy visited a friend's house, he suddenly felt very envious. Thus several autumn days passed, mostly on the estate of Earl Canrell. The young prince gradually grew up and spent more and more time studying. After the dismissal of Euge's tutor, it turned out to be difficult to find a replacement, and a gap appeared in the boy's knowledge. So Marie tried to teach him everything she herself had learned on her own. Firstly, she tried to teach the little prince to write. However, the prince was very bored. At 4 years old, he was going through his first big crisis. He wanted to play chess, but the nanny forbade him because she promised to write 10 sentences first. For several months now, the children have not left the mansion, but they also haven't had time to get bored. Now the little prince tried to finish his work as quickly as possible and break free. The nanny praised him for his diligence and allowed him to play a little as a reward. Everything was going well for the little prince, but the nanny began to worry about Ellie's education. It was difficult to compare her to the academy, but the girl went to school with the neighborhood children. However, this was only until the ban on leaving the count's mansion after the incident. The girl was always with the prince during his lessons, so after a few days, she said she wanted to become a teacher. Marie didn't understand what she was talking about at first, so Ellie had to repeat it a second time. At first, the girl was surprised that Ellie showed such a sudden desire. However, the girl felt ashamed and said that she had been thinking about this for a long time. She spent a long time as a prince and decided that she liked small children. She loved them very much and believed that she already knew how to take care of them. The girl saw her older sister teaching the prince to write, and her desire only increased. Marie was very happy about this because Ellie promised to study attentively and diligently. However, she believed it would be easier for her sister if she became a maid. They accept girls of her age as students, so she will start working immediately, and her sister will have more money. However, Marie said she would be happy if the girl chose what she likes. The count took care of them only because they were children, but they couldn't stay here forever. Suddenly, someone knocked on the heavy door and interrupted the conversation between the two girls. It was the count himself, who didn't understand who was inspiring the girls to worry about such trifles. He was surprised that there was still a light on somewhere, so he came to check and asked to close the door before going to bed. Our heroine said that she normally checks everything before going to bed. Ellie felt embarrassed by her words, so she grabbed her sister's skirt to protect herself. The young count walked slowly towards the girl and crouched down in front of her. He allowed the girl to live here as long as she wanted, because they were valuable friends of the prince. However, he still asked the girl why she suddenly wanted to become a maid. Then the nanny explained that, in reality, the girl dreams of being a teacher. The count praised this idea and said she would be a good and kind teacher. He believed that someone as kind and intelligent as Ellie would do a good job in this profession. The man cordially promised to find her a tutor, which greatly surprised Marie. The two sisters quickly looked at each other, unable to believe their own ears. Ellie believed the count had already helped them enough, so she was ashamed to accept even more help. However, the man truly wanted to help the girl achieve her dream. But first, Ellie wanted to try starting this path on her own. The count agreed, but added that if she needed help, she should contact him at any time. Ellie was very happy about this and thanked Lord Count from the bottom of her heart. A little later, Marie said that the girl had always been a child to her, so she was very surprised by her adult behavior. It seemed as if the prince was running away from her just yesterday and didn't want to put on warm shoes. The count noticed that time passes very quickly with children. They grow every day. The nanny loved recalling her early days with the young master when he was still very small. The girl was lost in her memories and didn't notice that the man had been watching her for a long time. He thanked the girl for everything she did for his family. He said he would do everything possible for his people, so he asked them not to worry and accept his help. With a trembling hand, he wanted to take the nanny's hand, but changed his mind at the last moment, and they walked away, embarrassed. Suddenly, the young man asked the girl if she had any dreams of her own. Maybe she had it in the past, or she has it now. He was interested in everything. Marie used to want to take care of children, although she didn't get a job in a nursery. She still raised her children. The girl said that in a past life her dream came true, and then she came here. After these words, Marie looked a little sad, but still smiled. Now she just wanted her children to grow up safe and sound. The count noticed that they were already growing up in care and affection, so he didn't need to worry about that. After that, the two young people said goodbye and went to their rooms. Kentrell thought that if a girl had a dream, whatever it was, he hoped to stay close to her. A little more time passed, and the real winter arrived and snow fell. Marie knew that Ellie and the young prince were now in class. The girl was sure that these children really wanted to leave the count's mansion. She was right, because all their lessons took place in the young count's huge library. Ellie diligently completed all the assignments, and the little prince wanted to go for a walk. The young man immediately tried to check the homework and point out the places where mistakes were made. During all the time since the incident, the offender was found. The nanny tried to cheer up the children's school days, so she brought them hot chocolate. The girl also took care of the young count, preparing a cup for him too. 84-86. Under his leadership, the lessons were more meaningful and useful for the children. Marie only wanted the children to put effort into their studies and not make the count waste time in vain. She closely watched how much her little Ellie tried to complete all the tasks. The nanny looked at her little sister, and concern could be seen on her face. This was too noticeable, so the young count asked what the girl was worried about. She believed that the young man had exceeded a little with the amount of educational material. To become a teacher, one must pass an exam, because at one point she passed the state exam. So it's better to study with him. At that moment, the young prince raised his hand and said that he had completed everything. Ellie jumped up at the same time and also asked to check her solution. Both children looked at the count, anxiously awaiting the results. The young man accepted their decision and let the children play a little. The nanny advised the children to bundle up and wear gloves before going out. She worried that these children might stumble and fall because it was slippery outside. While thinking about this, the young count placed his hand on the girl's shoulder to get her attention. The first snowfall fell outside, so he invited Marie for a walk together. The girl smiled sweetly and agreed to this idea very gladly. A romantic atmosphere arose between them again, which was witnessed by the children's butler. He brought warm clothes for his master because it was cold outside. The young count took a warm woolen coat from his butler's hands. However, first of all, he carefully threw warm clothes over the nanny's shoulders. The girl advised him to warm up too, but she appreciated this care. She was very embarrassed that the count paid attention to her right in front of the butler. But the man expected this, so he took 2 coats at once. The count appreciated his butler's foresight and praised him for it. After that, everyone went out together to leave tracks in the first snowfall of the year. When the young people went outside, the children were already having fun and playing with all their might. Marie extended her hand forward, and several beautiful snowflakes fell on it at once. The girl was happy to encounter her first snowfall in this place. She remembered how she held the young prince in her arms when he still couldn't walk, as if it were yesterday, and now he ran so fast on his own 2 legs. And the count, who seemed heavy, was now perceived by her completely differently. Now they could even walk side by side. Marie raised her head and noticed that the young man was looking at her with a strange gaze. The girl couldn't take her eyes off him, not even when he got very close to her. The count seemed very embarrassed and said that he wanted to talk to the nanny about something. The girl believed that he was very kind to everyone, but she couldn't believe anything else anymore. However, they were never allowed to talk, because a snowball was already rushing towards them from behind. The count, like a true military man, immediately sensed the danger behind him. He turned sharply, hugged the nanny, and protected her from the blow with his hand. The young people turned around and saw that it was the young prince, who had made a snowball, and threw it at them. He, unlike Ellie, did not understand at all what kind of atmosphere was around the count. And the nanny. The girl did not want to bother her older sister, so she grabbed the prince and offered to play somewhere else. However, the count realized that the necessary atmosphere was still destroyed. He did not want to neglect the children and suggested talking another time. The nanny, relieved and delighted, agreed to play with them for a bit. There was no rush, because now the most important thing is health and safety. A little later, everyone was sent back to the mansion to warm up and dry off. The nanny started building a strange structure that the boy saw for the first time. Ellie explained that these were special stages for puppet shows. The little prince had never seen a puppet show before, so he was intrigued. After a while, the puppeteer entered the hall and greeted his audience. However, it turned out that this was not a person specially hired by the master, but the count himself. Some time ago, a young man invited a nanny to his office and showed her his idea. He reminded the girl how they used to make cards for the little prince. The young man noticed that the children were completely tired of sitting in the mansion all the time, so he decided to entertain them a little and put on a small show. At first, he wanted to become a traveling musician because he knows how to play the piano. In the original story, the count did not appear as often, so Marie did not even know about his talents. The girl was impressed by her master's imagination and even praised him for it. The count admitted that he not only knows how to play the piano, but also several other musical instruments. The young man realized that the nanny lied last time when she said she couldn't play anything. He easily understood this from the expression on her face at that time. Marie admitted that in her world, musical instruments are much more accessible. You can learn to play them just by attending school. She promised that next time, she would show the count the music from her homeland. The man was happy to have found something in common with the girl he liked. Together, they could organize a real puppet show for children. It was a story about the adventures of a brave knight and his friends. The performance was very exciting and forced the children to follow every move of the puppets. The story included sword fights and other battles. The prince was especially glad that a real dragon took part in the performance. The legend said that if you give flowers to the dragon, a wish will come true. The plot was so fascinating that all the spectators followed it closely. The nanny was really interested in the story and enjoyed watching it. After a while, the children fell asleep, tired after a long walk. And a wonderful fairy tale. The butler approached the sleeping prince and took him in his arms, helping the nanny. The man said he would take the young master to his bedroom and put him to bed. Taylor approached Marie, took Ellie from her, and promised to do the same. After that, everyone dispersed, leaving the count and the nanny alone. The two young people sincerely thanked each other for a job well done. The nanny noticed that the young master really liked everything, especially the dragon. The count said that there are real dragons in his world and asked the girl about her world. The nanny laughed and said that their dragons are just creatures from legends. Kentril didn't understand what she was talking about and asked for some examples. The young people just laughed at this situation and had fun. Nanny Marie promised that someday she would tell all of this in detail. The count took the figure of the knight in his hands and asked the girl not to take away the princess. He said that he had prepared another special performance just for her. It was nice for Marie that he made such an effort, but she was ashamed. The count said that he worked on this performance in secret because he thought the girl was also bored sitting in the mansion. The nanny sat on the luxurious sofa, and the young master returned to the stage. He placed the figures of the princess and the knight very close and began his story. It was clearly a very sweet love story that began with a confession. All this seemed very awkward, so the count asked not to take him away from the process. Cantrell was terribly worried that everything would go well, so he was afraid of getting lost. Marie immediately realized that the man was trying to recreate a short story from a popular romantic novel. She was very amused, but the girl tried to speak seriously and apologized for her behavior. The count was fascinated by the beautiful sight of Marie and did not dare to continue. He looked directly into the girl's eyes and said that the princess didn't even know how strongly the knight was changing just because of her. He began to express his emotions more openly, not just respect or banal sympathy. It was just a performance, but the nanny's heart began to beat faster, as if the count were saying this about her. The man continued to play the role and admitted that he realized his feelings for the princess. Immediately after realizing it, he understood that he truly loved her. The nanny could hardly hold back tears of happiness, hoping that the young man was talking about her. She was very embarrassed. Her heart pounded like crazy. It was absolutely impossible not to fall in love with such a warm and sweet person. But even aside from his noble status, he was too good for her. The girl was not sure if she could afford to love such a man. However, she only thought that she would be very happy being by his side. This story moved her to tears. But the girl was not sure if she could make the count happy. Now they felt very good. But she was still locked in someone else's body. Therefore, the nanny was not sure if she could make the count's future happy. And the prince, the young count accompanied by a servant, strolled through the royal palace and arrived at an audience with the king himself, who was glad to see him. The man bowed his head in greeting and announced that his humble servant had arrived. The king asked if the man had managed to solve his personal problems, which he had been busy with during his vacation. The count did not go into details. He simply handed over the documents for approval. However, the king was interested, among other things, in what kind of young servant was behind the count. The boy was clearly afraid of meeting such a high-ranking person in the state. Wilda was a commoner who handled things well in the absence of the prime minister himself. He was acting, so the count decided to help him move forward. The boy admitted that he did all the work himself, but the count still approved him. In this case, the king offered to reward the young man for his efforts. His Majesty said that since the prime minister reviewed the work, then everything was in order. However, the count insisted that the king personally check all the documents and not take it so lightly. After this, His Majesty hinted that he had appointed the wrong person for the position of prime minister. With this, he stopped the count so that he would not dare to say anything to him. Cantrell understood everything immediately and asked if he could reward Wilda for his work. The king allowed it, after which the count asked His Majesty to grant a title to this commoner. The young man was so excited that he couldn't restrain himself and exclaimed right in front of the king. The ruler noticed that when he placed the count next to him, there was a resonance in society. There were many rumors then, but now the count was simply trying to give talented people what they deserve. He assured that he could entrust matters to this young man, even in his absence. The king noticed that the count spoke as if he were going somewhere in Chalguna. The man said he was just letting him know how much he trusted him. The king doubted it was worth granting the title to a commoner, because royal power was already unstable. Even when the count was appointed prime minister, the aristocrats couldn't calm down for a long time. What the king needs most now is talented people, so he must agree, even if it is not an easy decision. Then the count won't have to worry when he is away from his house, because he himself needs an effective assistant. Cantrell advised raising the boy so that the king's power could be strengthened. The lowest title was enough. As long as it wasn't hereditary, the aristocrats would not resist. The young man pointed out that even that award was already a great honor for him. The king promised to think about this proposal, but for now he dismissed the guests. The count was about to leave when at the last moment his young protege caught up with him. Wilda thanked his boss once again for the opportunity he had given him, and happily headed home. Cantrell was happy for the young man and got into his luxurious carriage. Derek was already waiting for him there and said he had everything ready. The count apologized to his old friend for having to deal with all this. The young man knew that even though the king said he would think about it, he would not allow himself to part with such talent. Even His Majesty believed that the count was on the side of the suspect. Cantrell knew that a call for more new maids and servants would soon be announced. He asked Derek to prepare and send his people there. The count suspected the queen, who benefited from the death of her brother, and of his parents. However, he didn't understand if she was targeting his nephew, because she might hold a grudge against the whole family. The count promised to give a list of the families who were expelled during his parents' previous adventure. He asked to track them all, but still told him to take care. Derek was grateful to the master for taking care of him too. During the whole way home, the young men discussed their business and plans. The carriage arrived at the count's estate late in the afternoon. As it was getting dark, the young man headed to the main entrance, where the nanny was already waiting for him. She met the count and noticed he was late for work. The young man was surprised that the girl was waiting for him even at night. The nanny regained her composure and pretended that she was simply asked for help, but found him on the way back. The girl understood that it was some kind of strange excuse, so she felt embarrassed. Despite this, the count was happy that she came to meet him from the road. Marie couldn't look the man in the eyes after that puppet show, but she still thought it was very rude to constantly look away. The girl tried to make eye contact, but now the count didn't want to turn around and look at her. Marie even thought she had done something wrong, and he was angry with her. If she is not sure she can make this person happy, she won't be able to open up. Still, the girl decided to simply not interfere in the course of events. She has already told him everything. The count can handle the rest himself. The nanny was about to retire, but suddenly, the image of the little prince appeared in her head. Marie stopped being shy, approached the young man, and took his hand first. She saw that something was clearly wrong, and now she didn't want to turn a blind eye anymore. The count was amazed by the courage with which the girl acted. Marie looked him in the eyes and said that he was lying, and that obviously something had happened at the palace. She was worried about both the count and the prince. They all became close to her. Even if they didn't have a future together, Marie wanted them to be happy. However, the count remained silent and simply pushed her hand away. The girl felt embarrassed by her behavior, but her lie was too obvious. The prince looked too much like his uncle, as if he were his own son. Marie felt hurt by the fact that he opened up to the count and told him everything about herself. That's why she said that he too could talk about all the difficulties that troubled him. The young man thought for a moment, deciding whether to tell her what happened or not. The nanny added that if he remained silent, she wouldn't say anything either. After these words, the count recognized the nanny's good instincts and surrendered to her. Marie was happy that she managed to convince the man to trust her. The young man admitted that he had a really bad day today. The nanny advised the count to speak if he found it difficult. However, the young man noticed that it was the girl who had more difficulties in the alien world. Marie admitted that she would be happy if a man told her about his difficulties. She only asked him not to think that she was imposing on him, but the count did not believe it. Cantrell thought for a moment where to start his story. He admitted that he still had something to tell the girl. The count said that he suspected the queen and her uncle of the crime. Marie was very surprised, because they were important figures in the state. In the original, these two played an important role. The count tried to contribute to the destruction of the palace. The man explained that it was these two who benefited most from the death of his brother, his sister-in-law, and his parents. His parents died as a result of a road crash, and the same thing happened to his brother. He was falsely accused of corruption, and before the charges could be dropped, an accident occurred. After his death, part of the power passed to the queen's family. Power struggles were common in history, so it was easy for Marie to understand. If Cantrell's uncle invaded the family's power, then the king might also have something to do with it. Marie did not grow up in a particularly good family. Her relatives did not threaten her. If her conjectures are confirmed, the prince will have an unpleasant surprise. The young people could only hope that this was not the work of the queen and her father. The count asked the nanny not to worry and promised that he could protect her. And the children. Marie was very happy that this man took care of her. However, she remembered that one must protect not only them, but oneself too. The girl even put her little fingers together to promise each other that they would take care of each other. The count did not understand what this gesture was for, so he froze for a moment. However, he then decided to trust the girl and simply repeat after her. Some time later, the little prince ran down the hall carrying the exam results in his hands. He dreamed of quickly showing his beloved nanny his top scores. He was especially proud of getting 100 out of 100 points on one of his exams. The boy looked at Marie and asked how well she thought he was doing. In fact, he had a hidden motive, because they promised him a reward for good grades. Marie kept her promise and showed the letter the postman brought. It was not in vain that the prince became interested in writing, which he hated more than life itself. After reading Bari's letters, he wanted to write to the boy himself. The nanny was happy that the boy directed his interest in a useful direction. The boys went to the hall, and everyone started reading a letter from their brother at the academy. The boy wrote that he missed all his friends and dreamed of returning home as soon as possible. He wrote that he would be angry if his older sister fainted again. He wished the little prince to eat well, have fun, and grow up. Bari even assumed that everyone would read his letter together. The boy talked about how hot his last summer was. Next to the training ground, there is a large tree under which they constantly rest. Even the boy thought that a similar one was growing in his county, under which the prince played. And Ellie, he also admitted that he wouldn't have written if the boys hadn't pressured him to do so. The boy was eternally grateful to the count for everything he does for them, and also promised that he would return home in a semester, and then they could spend many more happy days together.